Chapter 123. The huge skeleton took a step forward and raised its battle axe. Even though it was still behind a wall, the experienced Brendel knew that he was already within its attack range, and he could not help but feel a chill in his heart. He couldn't think of any way to defend himself, and the only chance he had was to sacrifice an arm to save his life. He had already made the decision. But at that moment, a handsome young man with silver hair and purple eyes walked out from the corner with a gloomy expression. He was about 25 or 26 years old, and he bumped right into Brando. Behind him were two soldiers wearing dark blue knight's uniform, silver breastplates, long swords and silver scales on their epaulets. It was the uniform of the silver-winged cavalry. This young man was one of the lieutenants of the silver-winged cavalry's commander, the illegitimate son of the Duke of Grenoir's Viscount Turst. When he saw Brando, he seemed to have thought of something, but his face quickly turned gloomy. Without saying a word, he pulled out a thin sword from his waist and stabbed towards Brando's left chest. His speed was fast, and his sword was both accurate and ruthless. It was hard for a normal person to see, and it looked like a thin silver line drawn in the air. But Brendel's reaction was quick, and he knew it was an enemy when he saw the enemy's expression. But he did not know how strong the enemy was, and he was unarmed, so he could only subconsciously protect his vitals and dodge to the side. Viscount Turst was stunned. He didn't expect an ordinary iron-ranked mercenary to be so alert. He only managed to adjust the angle of his attack in the end, but the thin sword only pierced through Brando's shoulder like a venomous snake, leaving behind a trail of blood. Brando groaned and fell to the side. He was shocked. He saw clearly that Turst was a middle-ranked knight, and he was at least a gold-ranked fighter. Luckily, Turst wasn't paying attention when he attacked, or else he would be a cold corpse by now. He didn't have time to think about how he had offended a level 3 expert, and such a young one at that. This guy must be an enlightener. In fact, Brando wasn't wrong. Turst wasn't just an enlightener, he was also the holy son of all for one. Compared to most of his peers, this young man had the right to be arrogant. But this was the second time Brando had failed. Turst had never failed before, but ever since Borg Nine-Eye's disappearance, his daughter's disappearance had been a few days ago. They already knew that Borg Nine-Eye's family was related to Borg Nine-Eye's family. Nesson's family might be related to the Cipher dynasty from more than 100 years ago. This was related to a huge secret, but he had originally concluded that a noble's daughter would not be able to play any tricks. He did not expect this confidence to disappear under his nose. He had always been frivolous on the surface, but he was cautious on the inside. However, this was the first time he had tasted the bitter fruit of failure. There was also the young man in front of him. All the information he gathered in the past few days pointed to a mistake in their information gathering. Based on the information gathered, all for one in Braggs could conclude that there was a leader above the Copper Dragon Reto. It was a young man, so Turst's first suspicion was that Brando had appeared with Badam that day. Of course, it was just a thought, and Turst didn't take it to heart. He just didn't expect to meet Brando in a place like this. The moment he saw Brando, he wanted to test him out. But his test was to kill him. Even if he killed the wrong person, it wouldn't matter. After all, he was just a nameless mercenary. But he didn't expect Brando to give him a surprise. A huge surprise. When Brendel fell, he went right between Turst and the two soldiers, and used the momentum to roll behind the three of them. Our Viscount could not help but be startled. Just as he was about to turn around and strike again, the wall in front of him suddenly cracked open. The bloody pointed helmet of the Crusader executioner poked out from under the small door, and then it stretched forward. The giant axe lifted the entire wall and caused it to collapse to one side. Turst was shocked and deflected the axe with his sword. The wind from his sword caused the wall to collapse, but he couldn't help but exclaim, "The Crusader executioner." The giant skeleton wouldn't show mercy just because he was a core member of All for One. The first thing it saw in its burning eye sockets was Turst's slender sword that blocked its axe. Its soul fire flickered, and its right claw pierced towards the heroine's ribs. If the claw connected, the upper half of an ordinary person's body would probably explode. However, Turst didn't panic and raised his left hand to block the Crusader executioner's attack. His movement wasn't large, but the giant skeleton's claw couldn't move an inch forward. "Go catch that young man." The Crusader executioner was infamous for its ferocity, and this monster was a silver-ranked swordsman. Even a newly promoted gold-ranked swordsman like him did not dare to underestimate it. He could only order his subordinates to stop Brendel. Unfortunately, Brando was smarter than he thought. In fact, when he rolled forward, he had already considered letting the Crusader executioner clash with the skeleton. Before the giant skeleton could attack, he had already shaken them off and made his escape. The Elemental Enlightenment Scroll, was in the room outside the door. If the wind spirit spiders didn't find the wrong room. Brando slammed the door open, and the first thing he saw was a set of mana potions on the table. Of course, he recognized them because they were created by him and Tamar. These were the mana potions he sold to the auction house. Brando felt a chill in his heart. He still found the wrong room. But he was startled, and then he saw the box on the chair beside him. The young man's breath couldn't help but quicken slightly. He saw that familiar burnt yellow parchment lying quietly in the box. That was it, the scroll that could save his life. If he used the Holy Sword card to activate the second level of power, even if it was only temporary, Brando was confident that he wouldn't be at a disadvantage against a gold-ranked opponent. At the very least he could escape without a problem. He immediately rushed over and grabbed the scroll. Then he bit his finger and smeared his blood on the center of the scroll. The elemental contract was so simple. The scroll glowed and began to burn. It was different from the fire of the mortal world. It came from the domain of the fire element, the elemental fire of the Hell Babatar Abyss, which was also the fire of the contract. In Wand, whether it was the angels of heaven or the demons of the underworld, they all used the elemental fire to carve the mark of the contract. This tradition originated from the beginning of the world, when Martha and the Fire Spirit King made the first contract. In fact, this tradition was not encouraged throughout history. Even the merchants in the human world used the method of branding on parchment to establish contracts before the Age of Chaos. It was also influenced by it. After the contract of fire was established, the same pattern on the scroll randomly appeared on the back of Brando's hand. This was the elemental pattern, the symbol of an elementalist. Brando carefully checked his elemental pattern and found that it was the most common pattern of fire in Erewhon. He couldn't help but sigh. He thought that he should have some special patterns. Not to mention the 6 elemental sacred patterns of Tumen, at least a 3 or 4 elemental pattern would be good. A single elemental was the most unpromising type of elemental. But fortunately he didn't do it to become an elementalist. The prompt of the establishment of the contract was projected on his retina as usual, a line of green words faintly. Then his elemental pool was formed. There were 6 slots of each element, 7 slots of fire element, and no light and dark elemental pools. Seeing this, Brando once again confirmed that this body did not have the potential to become an elementalist. The player elementalist had 17 slots of each element and a complete light and dark elemental pool. Even so, it was only the qualification of an elementalist. Of course, at least it was much better than Brando's state. If there was a description to describe Brando's state, it would be that he was the most unsuitable person to become a wizard or an elementalist. He was just lucky enough to open an elemental enlightenment scroll. A single fire arrow requires 3 fire elements. That means if I'm an elementalist, my elemental pool is only enough for me to cast lesser spells twice a week. Lesser spells that are not part of the 12th circle are called lesser spells. The Shire's magic arrow was a typical secondary spell. Although he didn't want to become an elementalist, seeing this nondescript elemental pool, Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry for a while. He coughed and suddenly heard footsteps outside the door. He didn't know if it was the young man with the strength of gold. His heart tightened and he subconsciously wanted to grab the mana potion on the table. But this time he grabbed empty air. Just as he stretched out his hand, he realized that he was no longer in the auction house. He found himself in a vast expanse of darkness. The room, the table, the mana potion, and everything that should have existed had disappeared, leaving only a vast darkness that he had never seen before. No, Brando suddenly remembered that he had seen this kind of darkness in the game. That was when he died. He couldn't help but be shocked. Was he already dead? But this was not a game. Then what was this situation? He couldn't help but look around. The first thing he thought was whether he was in an illusion. But let's not talk about whether this was superfluous. At least in the illusions he had heard of, there was no such thing. Unless it was an illusion that directly affected the mind. But that kind of illusion would stimulate the unyielding talent. It was impossible for him not to notice it at all. But in the next moment, Brando was stunned. He saw a young man with shoulder-length black hair and a pair of ghostly blood-red eyes walk out of the darkness. The young man looked at him and smiled slightly. His delicate hand that was as beautiful as a woman's gently brushed the silver robe on his body. Then he smiled and said, "It seems that you are very confused." Brando recognized the robe on the young man's body. It was the robe of an elementalist. It was just that the 4 crisscrossing blood-red patterns on the sleeves of the robe made him slightly startled. Among the high-level elementalists, those who mastered level 12 spells became elementalists. They were the envoys of the Elf King. There was a pattern on the elementalist robe. Those with 2 patterns were the great teachers of the elemental throne. Those with 3 patterns were the demons who had long been known as the sage. What were the 4 patterns? Brando could only think of one name. The elemental emperor, Tumen. This young man did indeed fit the description of the Myrna people in the myths. He had black hair and blood-red eyes, and was a follower of the dark dragon. But he hesitated for a long time, not daring to confirm whether this young man was the legendary figure. Tumen had been dead for thousands of years, hadn't he? But the young man seemed to see the doubts in his heart. He smiled and nodded. I am Tumen. You're Tumen? Brando was so surprised that he even forgot his situation for a moment. Why are you here? That's not important, Brando. Tumen replied, my last contractor died almost 300 years ago, and the last person who carried these cards was unwilling to give up his path as a knight. It's just that I didn't expect that in just a few decades, there would be a new successor. He paused for a moment and smiled. What I mean is, are you willing to stop for a while and listen to the story of the Planeswalkers? Planeswalkers? Brando was slightly startled. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 125. Planeswalker? Brando almost groaned. He couldn't help but touch his forehead, wondering if he was dreaming. The young man in front of him who claimed to be Tumen and the special space that brought him into, as well as these bizarre messages, all made his mind a mess. He had never heard of a profession called Planeswalker in the Amber Sword. He first wondered if it was a profession that he had never understood. After all, in a world with such a huge and complicated setting and self-improvement every day, it was impossible for him to be omniscient and omnipotent. But then Brando felt a little awkward, and his intuition told him that this conjecture was not valid. Brando looked calm on the surface, but in his heart he kept thinking, what is going on? What is a planeswalker? What is this place? Tumen's hands were in his sleeves, and his whole body was floating in the dark void. He saw Brando's doubts and replied with a smile, it seems that you are still very confused. In fact, this is just a refraction spell. It allows the message I left behind to be projected in your mind through this, so you don't have to be nervous. This is just your own inner world. Everything here is constructed according to your inner thoughts. Brando knew that he meant to say subconscious. You mean this is a spell effect that affects the mind? But why is my unyielding will not respond? He calmed down a little but immediately asked, how do I get out of here? Because he suddenly remembered that he was still in danger and could not waste time here. Why are you in a hurry to leave? Because this is the world in your mind. Everything happens here as fast as your thoughts. The Bastions have a saying, people can finish a long dream in a short moment. Because people's thoughts are as fast as lightning, you can have many thoughts in an instant, and before these thoughts are over, not even a second has passed. Tumen laughed and said, even if you are going to die in the next second here, you can live for a quarter of an hour. Brando carefully digested the meaning of the Elemental Emperor's words. Rationally, he was more willing to believe this explanation, but instinctively he could not help but consider the danger outside. He took a breath and asked, I understand, but let's finish this message quickly. Emperor Tumen, what do you want to say to me? What is a planeswalker? Forcing himself to calm down, Brando began to figure out the meaning of this dream. Since Tumen said that this was a projection of a message, it meant that he had something to tell him. Do you have anything to say? Brando didn't think that there was any connection between them. Brando was a pure-blooded southerner of Erewhon. He had neither the blood of the Myrnas nor the blood of the Bastions. In terms of inheritance, Tumen would not have looked for him alone. Moreover, there must be some kind of medium to store the spell. In other words, this message was originally stored on something close to him through a triggered spell. Brando lowered his head and could not help but recall carefully, trying to find the suspicious points of the things on his body. First of all, he had to rule out the ordinary items, his clothes, and some small items such as matches and kindling. Excluding the items that he and Tamar had made, such as the cursed crossbow, the statue of the saint, white deer, and the mana potion. Finally, it was natural items such as the fruit of the golden demonic tree, and some magic materials. Now, the only things that could be considered suspicious were the trivial items he had obtained from the battlefield and the ring of the Wind Empress. But those trivial pseudo-magic items were nowhere to be found. The Ring of the Wind Empress had long been appraised in the game. It had a follow-up plot, and Brando had already asked the cripple. The lone shark did indeed know about the ring in the oil painting. According to him, the oil painting was given by a merchant to a knight that Brando's grandfather used to serve. Then, the knight gave the oil painting to Brando's grandfather. After that, the oil painting was left in Brando's old house. As for the story before that, it was a long story. The cripple said that a total of 13 rings were made. Although they were not authentic, each ring was priceless after hundreds of years. At that time, the merchant wanted to curry favor with the local lord, but he did not know what happened after that. Even though Brando was still suspicious of the cripple's words, at least it meant that the ring had nothing to do with Tumen, even if it had something to do with the wind sage Saint Tassel. The next suspect was the mysterious stone fragment that he obtained from Borg Nessen's corpse. Brando had always suspected that the noble's background was not as simple as it seemed. Amandina was a noble's daughter, so how could it be so coincidental that she learned how to design and make magic devices? In Erewhon, this was not a common thing. Moreover, Brando believed that if he could detect this, others could as well. Turst must have understood this as well. He was beginning to suspect that the Viscount's motives were not simple. And now, it seemed that the stone fragment was the most suspicious. But he immediately shook his head and remembered something else. Before he entered this world, he had touched another unknown item, the Scroll of Elemental Revelation. Brando recalled the situation at that time. He clearly remembered that the Scroll of Elemental Revelation had the seal of the Crystal Forest and the unique serial number of the fairies. In other words, there was nothing wrong with the scroll itself. However, he had already come to his senses. He finally realized what the key to triggering this spell was: opening the elemental pool. But what was the connection? He immediately thought of the cards of fates. Yes, he had always treated these mysterious cards as skills and not items, so he did not think of them at first. But now that he thought about it, Brando realized that these cards were more suspicious the more he thought about it. First of all, these cards had never appeared in the Amber Sword. Perhaps Brando had not heard of a single magic item in the game, so it was not suspicious. However, if a series of magic items had never appeared in the eyes of a hardcore player, it would inevitably raise suspicions. Imagine for a moment, if a person had never heard of a magic item in the game, and if we assumed that the world was huge, then it would not be that hard to believe. But if he hadn't even heard of the concept of magician's profession equipment, then it would be a little strange. You might say that he must be a newbie. But Brando was not a newbie. Moreover, these cards themselves were not dispensable and insignificant items of little value. They contained a great deal of freedom, and even a warrior could freely control magic. Could be said that they formed a complete class system. There was no way that Brando had never heard of such a set of magic items. Not to mention that these things did not appear in some distant country. For example, they only appeared in Madara, Brando's archenemy. If that was the case, Brando would not have had the chance to know about them. On the contrary, the places where the cards appeared were places that he was most familiar with in the past. Gerald's Tomb, Golden Demonic Tree Valley, Fortress Reeden, Bragg's. These were places that Brando had explored countless times, and he knew every nook and cranny of these places like the back of his hand. Brando could even describe the rumors and actions of all the famous players in these areas in the first 3 years of the game. He loved this world so much that he could empathize with Erewhon. But the problem now was that he had never heard of these cards. He even suspected that he had let go of his suspicions so easily. Of course, he did not realize that the last time he saw these cards, he was in a situation where he could not even guarantee his survival. Normal people in such an environment would be overjoyed if they got a little help and not doubt it. That was why it was human nature. But once he realized it, his suspicions deepened. Brando could not help but touch his chest, and subconsciously remembered the thought that flashed through his mind. These cards form a complete class system. Brando's heart skipped a beat and he subconsciously raised his head. He looked up in disbelief and blurted out, "The planeswalker you mentioned is?" Tumen smiled, "You guessed it right. The cards of fate and the planeswalker are inseparable." Brando immediately shut his mouth, because he knew that the young Tumen in front of him would tell him everything. First of all, I want to clear up a misunderstanding. These cards of fate were not created by me. As you can see, their history is much older than what we know. Tumen opened his hand, and there was a card of fate in his palm. But it was the back of the card, and there was a complicated sacred pattern drawn on it. This mark you see is the original sample of the sacred pattern. I simplified it based on my superficial knowledge, and then compiled this knowledge and taught it to the humans, elves, and Myrnas. Wait. Tumen raised his hand, stopping Brando from asking. I know what you want to ask. As the descendant of the Basto and Myrnas, and the mortal enemy of all beings who yearn for the light, why would I help the humans and elves? He smiled. It's actually very simple. As a planeswalker, my way of looking at things is a little different from the average person. Of course, this is just my own point of view, but it has something to do with my own deck. I was too young at that time and blindly wanted to pursue the laws and principles of this world, so my deck was called All for One. Following the meaning of this deck, other than the most essential things in the world, there was not much difference in my eyes. After hearing this, Brando sat back down. He thought for a moment and asked the question in his heart. To be honest, he asked, I don't really understand what you mean, can you explain it more simply? He had no intention of going back now, but he had a vague feeling that this class of planeswalker would bring about a huge change in his future path. He did not know why he had this thought. Perhaps it was an illusion, or perhaps his intuition and instinct had already smelled a trace of something unusual. Tumen nodded. Of course, I will explain it to you in detail. He continued, speaking of planeswalkers, we have to start with the cards of fate. Planeswalkers are the only group of people in this world who can touch the true essence of the cards of fate. This essence is the power of the world. Every card of fate is a representation of the world from a certain perspective. It is not a simple projection of the laws, nor is it a superficial copy of reality. There are many such cards and they form a small world. Just like my deck, All for One, this deck uses the harmony of the 6 elements to describe the essence of the world. Therefore, it is also the meaning of my card, the power of the laws. As for the other planeswalker I know that his deck is called Unlimited Power. It's a deck made up of a large number of red and black cards of fate. His deck's intention is to pursue the highest power. The red cards can be seen as fire but also as power. The black cards can be seen as darkness, but also as death and destruction. Of course we all failed. Tumen smiled. Therefore the meaning of the cards is actually given by the deck. The magic of the cards of fate is that they can express your thoughts and ideas between the world and you from many angles. Even your deck of cards represents the other you in your heart. As for why these cards exist and where they come from, we actually do not know. The earliest planeswalkers were probably born during the Dark Ages and spread among the Matatanians. I even suspect that this class itself was born in this society. Rumor has it that the Matatanians are a nomadic race. Their tribe is always moving from one place to another. Their understanding of the world is slightly different from ours. We think that the world is vast and infinite, including infinite things and the concept of knowledge. But in the Matatanians' worldview, the world is a very small and narrow concept. They have a bigger concept that is similar to our world, called us. This word is the origin of the word infinity in the Elven and Cruz languages. In the Matatanians' worldview, us contains countless small worlds, and they are always moving between worlds. I suspect that they have misunderstood the relationship between the guarded ground and the world. Of course, the humans of the past had limited knowledge of the world. Tumen suddenly laughed and said, I accidentally said so many unimportant things. It seems that it is hard for me to change this habit of mine. Brando thought for a moment and asked, I have heard of the Matatanians before, and perhaps now I know that they are the earliest planeswalkers. But what does this have to do with me? Tumen shook his head and said, continue listening. The Matatanians divide the day into 6 stages, and a planeswalker's day is also strictly divided into 6 stages. The young man with shoulder-length black hair looked at Brando and continued, the first stage is from dawn to noon. The Matatanians call this period of the day, sun growth, and planeswalkers call it, growth stage. In this stage, planeswalkers can tap their land cards and obtain the necessary mana for the day. Wait! Brando shouted, tap land cards. Yes, tapping land cards is the most basic ability of every planeswalker. It is also the source of their power. Wait, can you explain it in detail? It is very simple. As long as you have a basic land card and your own elemental pool and mana pool, you can tap them at this time of the day, and the land card will connect the power of the territory they belong to with your elemental pool, and the elemental power generated in the territory will be injected into the land card. Wait, but didn't the land card say that one elemental power will be generated every week? Brando could not help but ask. That elemental power is outside of the elemental pool and mana pool. It is used as a card to lend new planeswalkers to understand and come into contact with the power of this world. Once you become an official planeswalker, you will no longer need it. Tumen replied. Brendel thought about it for a while and nodded. I understand. You can continue. During the growth stage, planeswalkers can also gain benefits from the pay ability of other cards. I remember that you have a gray earth type card called Highland Squire. It states that when the Highland Squire exists on the field, the Lord can gain 1 point of reputation every day. And this reputation point is the payment during the growth stage. At the same time, planeswalkers can use any cards that are related to green, life, nature. White, light, protection, nurture. Red, fire, vitality. Blue, water, nourishment, irrigation. And mixed cards that contain the above elements. Brendel furrowed his brows. He had never noticed this problem before. The Shire had mentioned a similar problem to him before, and he mentioned a special case, which was the white spell card that did not require any magic cards. Next, we enter the second stage of the day, from the morning to the scorching sun, which is from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Not only do the people of Matatanya call this time of the day the flourishing of all things, but the wizards and witches also call this time of the day the ebb tide. This is because this is the moment when the power of the sun is at its strongest and the power of the moon is at its weakest, which is also the time when magic is at its weakest. Magic and elements decrease and increase, so this is the time when the elements are the most active and aggressive. Thus, planeswalkers call this stage the flourishing stage. This is the only stage where planeswalkers can use any cards without any restrictions. At the same time, they can also draw 3 cards from their deck and put them into their hand. Wait, Brando was stunned. What does this mean? This is the rule of planeswalkers. At the beginning of each day, a planeswalker can only use a fixed number of cards in their hand. They may be able to draw more cards than this limit, but during the reset stage of the day, they must discard these cards that exceed this limit. And we call this fixed number of cards of fate the hand. On the other hand, the stronger a planeswalker is, the more cards he can control. For example, as a new planeswalker, you can only control 5 cards in your hand. Do I have to choose the cards in my hand? Brando asked. No, the cards in your hand will be drawn by you from the designated deck. Like me, my card will be all in one with the power of the 6 elements, so the rule divides my deck into 6 equal parts, so I have 6 decks. Tumen replied. Brando frowned, but if that's the case, the uncertainty increases a lot. Then, if I only control a few powerful cards and discard the useless ones, wouldn't I be able to freely maintain the strength of my cards at the same level? In theory, yes, but this is not the ultimate goal of a planeswalker. Tumen shook his head. Ultimate goal? You know that after the level 3 power system, some people can activate their elemental powers and become extremely powerful. But you may not know, but after activating your elemental powers, the next stage of power is the perfect body. From iron to gold, the final step is to pursue the existence of power that only exists in legends. You know, fire is an element. Its highest level is the fire element because the fire element is the origin of all flames in this world. But in fact, there has always been a rumor that above the fire element, there is an even higher level element, which we call matter. Like matter, time, space, and even logic, power, itself, these elements that represent the deepest meaning of the world, we call them the power of existence. Brando stared at Tumen, speechless for a moment. Of course, he knew about the perfect body because he had already experienced this stage in the past game, level 130 silver body. He had also heard of the power of existence, but it was rumored that after players reached level 160 and completed the golden body, their EXP would stop increasing. No one knew which final hurdle to break through to reach the power of existence, which was only one step away. However, none of them had expected that such a path actually existed. You mean, he could not help but ask, planeswalkers can finally reach the power of existence? Tumen nodded and pointed at the cards. When you perfect your world, when this rule can be self-consistent, the door to the power of existence will open. Of course, before that, you have a long way to go. Tumen seemed to have noticed Brando's interest and continued, start by building your most basic deck. What do I have to do? Brando asked subconsciously. Actually, from the moment you came into contact with the first card of fate, you had already revealed your own deck. But I'm a little curious, your deck is different from any I've seen before. It seems to represent a huge class system through the deck. I don't understand why you're interested in the class system, and this idea of all-class domination. What does that mean? Tumen thought for a moment and asked, puzzled. When Brando heard this, he could not help but sweat profusely. When he first came into contact with the cards of fate, he was still Sophie's soul. As a professional player, of course, he instinctively wanted to take up a powerful class. Most players had the dream of taking up all classes, but he did not expect the cards of fate to capture that dream. Only now did he realize what the opening of the Knight's Path meant. Damn! Brando screamed in his heart. If the cards were a manifestation of the world, could it really be all-class domination this time? P.S. I've just returned from tomb sweeping, so I won't be home for the next 2 days. I'll start updating tomorrow and make up for the words I missed last week. This chapter is about 7,000 words, so I won't split it into chapters to avoid inconvenience. So I'll just complain. Back in my hometown, other people eat meat and drink wine, but I'll just sit at the table and watch a table full of vegetables and porridge. Damn, this year was so miserable, I want to die when I hear about food. Because I didn't have much time, I wrote this chapter yesterday and today. I'm not used to using a notebook and I don't have any information on hand, so I don't know if there's any problem. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 126. Standing at the pinnacle of all professions, this was indeed a path of transcendence. But how do I become a planeswalker? Brando asked the key question. As soon as Tumen stopped, all the drafts he had prepared vanished into thin air. The last person he met was a Templar knight named Geronda. He tried his best to persuade the young man to give up his faith and join the ranks of planeswalkers. So Tumen was well prepared this time, but as soon as he opened his mouth, Brando seemed to have agreed. Of course, Tumen did not understand the difference between the mentality of a player who pursued higher and stronger power and the heart of a knight. Of course, to be able to find a qualified successor, Tumen was still very happy. He was not Tumen, but a message left behind by the talented planeswalker. When he completed this task, it meant that his thousands of years of mission could finally come to an end. So he immediately replied, "To become a planeswalker, you must first have your own territory in Uz. I told you before, Uz is a world called Infinity in Mediterranean mythology. This world is filled with countless strange half-planes. You have to tap the land card in your hand for the first time and establish your first territory." Tumen's tone changed. "This is the first territory of your kingdom. On its foundation, build your strong castle and summon your loyal knight. Build the first deck in your hand. From this moment on, you are a planeswalker who controls an independent world." Brando listened with fascination and could not help but ask, "Can I try?" Tumen nodded. "Of course you can. I remember that you already have a land card. That is your most original capital. But the key is how you are going to build your first deck." "Then how should I build my first deck?" Brando asked again. He knew nothing about the game system and had never heard of it. At this time he could only calm down and be a good student. But he could not help but wonder if the existence of planeswalkers was unique to this world, or had it never been discovered in the Amber Sword. But when he found the card in Geronda's tomb, it was not difficult. What made him discover it but others did not? Brando thought that there must be some kind of opportunity. But he had not found it yet, and could only quietly listen to Tumen's explanation. To build your own deck you must first understand the cards of fate. Apart from the card system, the cards of fate can be divided into several categories. The first category is creatures, including characters, heroes, beasts, monsters and even dragons. When you show this card, the summoned creatures will appear from the card. They have different attributes, different strengths and weaknesses, and some even have abilities. Tumen replied. "I already know about that," Brendel replied, "like the Shire and the Wind Spirit Spiders?" "Yes." "Then what about the second category?" "The second category is spells and abilities. The types of spells are determined by the colors of the cards. Red, green, blue, gray, cyan, gold, black, white and red attack, gray for protection, blue for changeable and black for mystery. The different colors of the cards not only determine the attributes of the spells, but also determine when they can be released. Among them, except for the white and cyan cards, which can be cast at any time and under any condition, most of the others have their own requirements. Similar to energy loss. Tumen nodded. The third category is treasures. The treasures must be white. The treasures' characteristics are that they must be attached to a medium when they enter the field. This medium can be the planeswalker himself, or the summoned creatures of the planeswalker, or even a barrier. Barrier? This is the fourth category of cards, barriers. Barriers have both the characteristics of spells and the characteristics of the field. Barriers cannot be moved, but they are powerful. The fifth category is called resources. Resource cards are very similar to land cards. They can be attached to both barriers and land cards. Resource cards are another source of strength for planeswalkers. Many high-level card decks require the support of resource cards. Then there is the sixth category, ritual cards. These are special cards, but as you gradually advance from a low-level planeswalker to a high-level planeswalker, you will gradually come into contact with these cards. The seventh category is events. This is another special card. There are many types of event cards, and they can be triggered and completed to achieve the effect on the card. At this point, he reminded Brando, event cards are a special type of consumable card. They can only be used once or more. They will not enter the graveyard but will completely disappear. Tumen talked for a long time, but he did not ask Brando to memorize the last few special cards. He said that as a planeswalker's strength increased, he would slowly discover and understand these cards. There was no need to fully understand them in the beginning. In the end, he replied, therefore, a planeswalker's deck is actually a combination of these different types of cards. By summoning creatures, casting spells, building barriers, and forming a complete set of offensive and defensive strategies. But here you can't order them to be arranged. Because the core rules will form a deck for you according to an idea in your heart, as we mentioned before. Tumen looked at Brando and asked, so, what do you think? So that's how it is. Brando felt a burst of excitement. He could almost imagine that once a deck was formed, he would almost have a whole new set of abilities. The most exciting thing was that this set of abilities did not need to take up any extra experience. It was equivalent to adding another profession to the original profession. If it was in the Amber Sword, it would not be described as strong, it would be super strong. Brando suddenly felt a surge of impulse in his heart. He answered subconsciously, since it describes a profession, then this set of cards will naturally manifest the original meaning of a profession. My first deck is a knight. A knight must first have a squire, and this is the creature card of this deck. There are also his warhorse and equipment, and this is the treasure card. Then there are the skills that make up the core of this class, and this is the magic card. Finally, his territory, castle, and income, this is the barrier card and the resource card. It was as if there was a thought in his mind that drove him to speak out these thoughts. In the end, even he was surprised because he did not expect himself to say these words. He only thought about it briefly in his mind. Tumen was not surprised, he just smiled slightly. In fact, he was smiling as he looked at Brando's every word. A card appeared between the two of them, floating in mid-air. The first card was the Grey Earth/Water hybrid card, Highland Squire, that had already entered the graveyard. The other card was a green wind element card, named Mercenaries of Lopez. The card was painted in a colorful style with a group of soldiers holding a swallow-tailed flag with a horn emblem on it. They were dressed differently, most of them holding crossbows, battle axes, and shields. The description of the card was, Mercenaries of Lopez, Alliance of the City 11, wind 8 mana 14 creature, human mercenary level 15 creature, place a team of 12 Mercenaries of Lopez into the field. Maintenance cost. When any Mercenary of Lopez placed on this card is on the field, pay 2 wealth per day. Since the year 172 of the First Era, the Mercenaries of Lopez have been known for their bravery and loyalty. When Brando talked about warhorses and equipment, 3 cards appeared. They were Holy Sword, Golden Battle Flag, and Silver Colt. When Brando talked about skills, 2 cards named Sun Blade and Sprint Drive, appeared one by one. When he talked about territories, castles, and income, the last card named Rich Gold Mine appeared out of thin air. Brando of course saw these cards. He was very surprised, but he could not stop himself from talking. When he finished, he let out a long sigh and asked in surprise, "What's going on?" "Other than your own Holy Sword and Highland Squire, the rest are the wealth I left for you." Tumen replied unhurriedly, "When you involuntarily reveal your deck, these corresponding cards will be removed from my deck and come to your hand. They will be the most basic components of your first deck. Of course, you may continue to improve your knight deck in the future, but no matter what, these cards in your hand are the foundation for you to walk the path of a planeswalker from now on." Brando looked at the cards and swallowed his saliva. This was a big harvest. He thought back to the auction where he spent a lot of effort to get a Wind Spirit Spider that was not very useful. He did not expect to get 6 cards in one go, and some of them were obviously stronger than the Wind Spirit Spider. He could not help but ask in a somewhat unrealistic manner, "These are all mine, and then what?" Then of course you have to tap the land cards to establish your territory so that your deck can be supported. But I have to remind you about the relationship between a deck and a territory. A deck of cards could receive support from multiple territories, but a territory could only support one deck of cards. That is to say, different card decks have their own dedicated cards to support them. Don't expect a territory to support a card deck. A complete card deck often requires a large territory system to support it. Tumen answered seriously. So you need to collect more land cards and resource cards. They are the foundation of your strength. Brando nodded. Then let's start building your territory. Tumen continued, "Now take out your hidden grounds of the sacred tree, and show it." Brando did as he said. When he showed the card and tapped it, he saw a flash of green light in front of his eyes. However, he immediately realized that it was a soul-stirring green color that spread out in his spiritual world. The green color extended in all directions and gradually formed a lush and vibrant emerald forest. A tall and mysterious oak tree stood in the middle of the forest in a pool. That was the hidden grounds of the sacred tree. Brando then understood what the words on the card meant. Tapping it to create a forest meant. So this was a territory. He could clearly feel the connection between the forest and his spiritual world. He could see the forest as long as he willed it. But the forest was not in front of him. It was not even in the same world. Brando could feel the distance in his heart. It was a special feeling, as if it was both intimate and distant. Brando could not help but look up at Tumen with a surprised expression. After so many years in the Amber Sword, nothing could surprise him. Or at most he was excited but definitely not surprised. Not to mention, there was a sense of surprise and a hint of anticipation like this moment. This kind of feeling was really pleasurable for him. This land card is very mature in the basic land. You can see that it is very large and the edge of the territory has taken shape. This is a very advanced territory. It can provide you with 2 natural elements and 1 water element every day when you tap it. But in the future you will encounter some special lands or even legendary lands. These land cards will have much more powerful territories than the basic land. Tumen replied, "However, when you tap the land card, you lose the benefits of the resource card and barrier card attached to it even though you've absorbed mana and elemental elements." "What do you mean?" Brando was stunned. "First look at the cards you draw from the deck. The moment you establish your territory, you are already a qualified planeswalker. Your deck will automatically enter the deck, and the cards you change every day will also enter your hand." Brando opened his hand, and 4 cards appeared in his palm. They were Holy Sword, Mercenary of Lopez, Rich Gold Mine, and Sprint Drive. Look at the description of Rich Gold Mine. Tumen was like a teacher teaching a student as he patiently guided him. The young man glanced at the attributes and immediately understood what Tumen meant. Rich Gold Mine, Alliance of the City 7, Land 2, Resources, Mine Wealth, attach a rich gold mine to a land tile not tapped. Gain 4 wealth. Gold in the stone. Do you understand? Tumen asked. No matter if it's a resource card, a spell card, or a creature card, any card of fate can only be used once a day until between 10 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock the next day. This is the reset phase of the day, and the cards used the day before will be reset. At this time, the resource cards attached to the land card will return to the deck and wait for the next deployment. Brando nodded again. He felt that he had not nodded so many times in the past month. In front of Freya and the Roman, he was a mysterious young knight from the Karsuk Highlands who knew almost everything. But in front of Tumen he was only a primary school student. Another thing I want to remind you is that in the reset phase of the day, all cards of fate that have exceeded the limit of your hand or have been tapped, except creature cards that are maintained on the field, will be shuffled back to the deck. Then, in the next phase, maintenance phase, you will pay the cost of maintaining the creature cards, and if you do not have enough cards you will have to make up for it. At this point Tumen suddenly stopped talking. His expression changed and he patted Brando on the shoulder saying, "It seems that this is the end for this time. Your enemies have come knocking on your door. Of course, I don't want you to die as soon as you take over as my successor. Now that you are a qualified planeswalker, use your resources to deal with them." Brando was shocked, and only then did he realize that he still had many troublesome enemies in the outside world. The 2 soldiers from the Silver-Winged Cavalry were easy to deal with, but the mysterious gold-rank swordsman was a deadly enemy. Although Tumen kept saying that he could easily deal with these people as a planeswalker, Brando still did not understand where this ease came from. Just as he thought of this, he suddenly opened his eyes, and found that he was still in the same position of grabbing the mana potion not long ago, and the surrounding scenery had not changed at all. It was still a small room at the back of the small auction house that was in a mess. Everything that had happened before was like a dream. Elemental Emperor Tumen, the cards of fate, the planeswalker, everything seemed to exist in an illusion. But Brando knew that all of this was not an illusion, because he was still holding the cards in his hand. But the current situation did not allow him to think too much, because he could already hear footsteps almost outside the door. Brando immediately pulled out the card named Mercenary of Lopez from the 4 cards, and then grabbed the mana potion on the table and drank it in one gulp. At this moment he had 6 wind EP in his elemental pool, 11 wind elemental crystals in his hand, and 15 mana in his mana pool. It was more than enough to use this card. Brando did not hesitate and immediately displayed the card. 12 summoning circles immediately appeared in the room. Therefore, the 2 silver-winged cavalry regiments would never have guessed that when they burst open the door, there would be 7 crossbows, 2 swords, and 3 axes held to their necks in the small room behind them. Above Martha, these armed bandits looked like characters from a drama. They had curly beards and wore brightly colored clothes. They even had a layer of inlaid leather armor and a long cloak, and each of them held a round shield. The 2 soldiers could not help but widen their eyes. They did not know Brando's identity, but they were subconsciously following orders. Terse told them that Brando was a fugitive, and they naturally thought so. But now the 2 soldiers were completely stunned. These damn bandits dressed like that, did they think that they were the legendary mercenary of Lopez? That hateful young man was sitting in the middle of these bandits, and he looked at them with a prepared expression. P.S. I've been busy for the past 2 days. Everyone should understand that this chapter is the same as the previous one. Because it involves the core setting of the book and the main character's future path, it is not suitable to be separated into chapters, so it's better to combine them together. Also, I'll replenish the cards for today. When I have more cards in the future, I'll create a dedicated deck. Golden Battle Flag, Alliance of States I Gold, Light 5, Treasure. Mystical item, magical item, when the Golden Battle Flag is on the field, all creatures on the field will level up by 1 and gain the corresponding ability. The blood of the Bullyman family has never run dry. Silver Horse, Legendary Splendor V White, Mana 10, Treasure. Mystical item, mythical item, level 7 creature. The Silver Horse has the ability to float. Made of Mithril. White Sun Blade, Legendary Splendor 3 Gold, Light 5, Spell. Instantly deals 75 holy damage to the target, or instantly destroys the undead, level 40 creature or below. A golden light shines from the sword. Parallel Charge, Alliance of States 12, Gray, Earth 2, Spell. Instant choose 2 summon creatures on the field and grant them the ability to share damage and strength. The best tactic is to work together. Consul Zabu, to be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 127. The battle was over before it even started. Brando ordered the mercenaries of Lopez to toss the 2 unconscious silver-winged cavalry soldiers to a corner of the room. Then he realized that the swordsman might have already caught up to him. He clutched his left shoulder. The wound from the sword was still burning. With his current strength, even the slightest hesitation in front of a gold-tier rank 1 swordsman would be fatal. This was not like the battle with the Crusader Executioner or the White Knight Ebden. With a difference of almost 20 times, the effective experience was negligible. In other words, if Terst went all out, Brando wouldn't even be able to catch his movements. He wiped his sweaty, throbbing forehead and could not help but feel suspicious. Even though he did not know what the other party was up to, the fact that they targeted him as soon as they met made Brendel wary. He wondered if the swordsman was an assassin from the All for One because the only organization he had ever offended was this organization. But it didn't seem like it. All for One was low-key and secretive. Even if they wanted to take revenge, they wouldn't choose to do it in such a public place like the auction. Unless they were in cahoots with Madara. But that would be even more ridiculous. All for One worshipped chaos and were the secret followers of the Twilight Dragon. How could they be in cahoots with the Order of the Darkness, Madara? Brando shook his head to clear the messy thoughts in his mind. He pointed to his subordinates and said, "The 6 of you split up and run. The most important thing right now was to think of a way to stay alive." He gave the order, but immediately felt that it was unnecessary. Brando immediately had the urge to call them back, but after some thought he decided against it. It was better to be safe than sorry. After all, there wouldn't be much of a difference whether they were there or not. In the Amber Sword, if he could summon 12 iron-ranked warriors at his level, it would definitely be a very satisfying thing. But in this cold and unfeeling real world, there was a level 3 swordsman who seemed to be looking for trouble with him. This made him a little uneasy. Those who had unlocked the 3rd level of power would have an average strength of at least 100 ounces. Brando thought that since the opponent was a swordsman who rarely used thin swords, then he must have walked the path of elven swordsmanship. If he had more than 120 ounces of agility, then his reflex speed would be 23 times that of a normal person, and his burst speed would be 47 times. With the support of such an ability, the opponent could reach a speed of more than 700 kilometers per hour in a straight line, which was more than double the maximum speed of a Formula One car. It was even close to the speed of the earlier generation of jet fighters. His physique was strong enough to support him moving forward at this speed, offset the resistance wall, and the pressure on his internal organs. According to the Amber Sword's calculation method, a character with 120-ounce dexterity would have a constitution of at least 60-ounce dexterity. Such a person's skin alone would have a defense comparable to more than 200 millimeters of tilted armor. Brando thought about what kind of damage one of his most powerful attacks, Wind Bullet, could do to a 200 millimeters inclined steel plate. At most it would be a dent. In other words, a level 3 swordsman was almost a humanoid monster. Brando couldn't help but wonder if he would fly out and crash through the auction house if he were to exchange blows with such a person. If he wanted to, such a guy could search the entire auction house in a few dozen seconds, so even if he sent out all 12 of them, it would only delay him for a few seconds at most. A few seconds was nothing to him, but for the opponent, it was enough to kill him back and forth several times. Brando took a deep breath. He thought that since he came to this world, everything was still within the scope of his plan. He had been careful to avoid the existence of these high-level people. In the whole process of the adventure, the only flaw could be said to be that he accidentally provoked All for One, but he had also been careful to avoid the other party's gaze. But no matter how much he thought about it, he would never think that it was just a coincidence. He turned back to pull out the sword of the soldier and then turned back to look at the door. The remaining mercenaries of Lopez had sealed off the corridor, and the messy space in the corridor seemed to have been sucked dry of air, and it was filled with a dry and dead silence. This dead silence was unsettling. Brendel displayed the Holy Sword card. It spread its snow-white wings, and a huge sword with mysterious golden patterns appeared behind his back. This was the third time he displayed this card, and the power of honor surging on the sword seemed to be reflected into his body, as if he could destroy walls with a flick of his finger. But Brando understood that this was an illusion caused by suddenly gaining a huge amount of power. In fact, the Holy Sword card only compensated for his attack power, allowing him to enter the silver level in a certain aspect. But this power only gave him the comfort of being able to hurt his opponent. In fact, he understood that if they really fought, he might not be able to catch the opponent's movement and would be pierced through the throat. Of course, everything was not always the case, and Brando thought that he was not completely without a chance. At this time he finally heard a few screams coming from the corridor, and the mercenaries of Lopez card that was maintained in the secret ground of the Holy Tree instantly dimmed by half. Brando's heart tightened, and he looked up, just in time to see the silver-haired young noble slowly coming out from the corner. The man was wearing a short black cloak, and one of his hands was hooked around the hilt of a thin sword. The crystal-like sword had a few traces of blood on it. Brando recognized the sword, Crystal Scorpion Sting. In the Amber Sword, this sword's damage was not even in the top of the list of weapons above level 60, but the toughness and strength of the sword itself was one of the best. He remembered when he was still a hothead, he once heard a veteran say that if someone was used to using this kind of sword, at least it meant that he was very confident in his own strength. Brando did not dare to fully believe that, but from the way this young man acted, he did seem to be someone who was confident in his own strength. While he was dealing with Terst, the noble swordsman was also looking at him with his glassy purple eyes. The silver-haired young man's gaze first fell on the shadow of the holy sword behind Brando's back. He narrowed his eyes slightly, and then his gaze swept across the others. They were all iron-ranked fighters, and this young man had some strength, but in Terst's opinion, it was not a problem. At this time, since showing his fangs would be a deterrent, it was better to keep them. Terst sheathed his sword and smiled. It was a smile as sweet as a woman's. The young man raised his eyebrows slightly and asked, "Where have I seen you before?" Brando did not know what the young man was up to, but he could only force himself to be calm. He smiled disdainfully and went straight to the point. "Naturally, because about a minute ago you stabbed me in the shoulder. And before that, I'm sure I've never seen you before, sir." Terst replied with a hint of annoyance. As he replied, he quietly opened his status panel. Rows of data flowed down like water and appeared in front of him. First was the free experience, 4730. After the series of battles, his experience reserve had once again increased. Not only did the Elemental Revelation Scroll save him nearly 2,000 experience, he also skipped the series of quests to open the Elemental Pool. This was too important for him who was pressed for time. At this time, Terst shook his head without the slightest hint of anger. "No, that was even earlier. I'm sure I've seen you at the cavalry headquarters." Cavalry headquarters. That's right. Who are you? Brendel suddenly realized something, but when he thought about it, he relaxed instead. He let out a sigh of relief and looked at him calmly. My name is Turst, this is the name I gave myself. It means Tirid, in the ancient language of the Cruz people, meaning resistance. Turst smiled. If you're asking for my identity, I'm the deputy of the Silver-Winged Cavalry's commander, the third-rank sergeant major of the White Mane Army, Viscount Manowar of the Kingdom of Erewhon. But compared to these tedious titles, I still prefer my name. It's simple, but it's filled with the meaning of sacrifice. Brando rarely saw a person who could boast about his own name with such a smile, but now he had seen one. So it's him. Brando suddenly understood. Could it be that what they did in the Grey Rat tribe streets was exposed? But that was unlikely unless it was Cripple who sold them out. But would Cripple have the guts to do that? Brando shook his head and forced himself to calm down. He did not want to be caught red-handed. Viscount Turst. The illegitimate son of Duke Grinoires, Viscount Turst of the Manowar region. Such a person was not too conspicuous in Erewhon's short history, but he was not as unknown as a commoner. Brando's impression of him stopped at the tragic love story between him and a female bard. Of course, that was something that happened later. But Brando knew this person's personality. This Viscount was a person who appeared to be open-minded and eclectic, but his heart was so meticulous that it was close to being inflexible. Brando once suspected that Turst was the deputy of the Silver-Winged Cavalry's commander, Mechk, and that he might be involved with the Unifying Guild. And this person's whereabouts were mysterious, which proved this point. But when he first met this Viscount Turst, he could not help but be taken aback. Turst did not look like a person who had been oppressed and ostracized for a long period of time. Turst's face was calm, and perhaps he did not have good intentions. But this kind of malice was very calm, and did not make people think of words like fake or hypocrite. Turst's smile was like a beautiful venomous snake. Even though he knew it was dangerous, he still felt calm and graceful. Turst held his sword in a scabbard that looked like a walking stick. The meaning of this threat was obvious. But the silver-haired young man seemed to be saying, "There's something between you and me that needs to be settled. I won't rule out the possibility of stabbing you with my sword, but other than that, there's nothing we can't talk about." It was as if this kind of person did not care about life and death. He had his own attitude and goals. Seeing this, Brando knew that he would not be able to find any flaws in this person. But when he was still Sophie, he had a stubborn personality, or else he would not have fought with Madara for 10 years. That was why he calmed down and smiled coldly. "I don't remember offending you before, Viscount." Turst's purple eyes flashed. He always felt that this young man was not simple. Turst had made a sudden move, and the fact that a low iron-rank swordsman was able to escape was enough to prove that he was capable. But now he was even more certain of this. It was a simple sentence, but it was both a counterattack and a trap. Turst seemed to have grasped his personality. The silver-haired young man suddenly felt a little awkward. He could not help but rub his nose. Of course, he did not want to be led by the nose, but he could not pretend that he did not hear anything. His confidence did not allow him to do so. "Well said, but not everything in this world is given a choice," he replied. Brando narrowed his eyes slightly. Turst's first soft approach was followed by a hard one. It seemed that things were not going as well as he thought. But it was impossible for him to hand Amandina over to Turst. As he thought about it, he secretly allocated all his experience to the mercenary class. The mercenary class immediately jumped past level 11 and 12, and his total level reached level 20 for the first time. At the same time, his strength broke through the double digits for the first time, reaching 10 points. Even though it was not enough for Turst, it was still considered a mid-level iron-ranked fighter. "What are you trying to say?" He suppressed the power of the holy sword with one hand. His palm was sweaty, but his expression was calm as he asked, "Let's get straight to the point. What is your relationship with the Reto?" Turst seemed to have noticed Brando's small movements, but he did not say anything. Instead, he asked calmly. Turst's attitude made Brando even more nervous. As an experienced warrior, Brando could almost see Turst's path of attack from every direction, and he could not help but break out in cold sweat. "This Turst looks like he doesn't care, but he's actually very cautious of me." But he was more surprised by Turst's question. In fact, Brando's expression almost changed when he heard this question. Fortunately, he was a veteran and his mental fortitude was not just for show. It was only then that he calmed down and exhaled without leaving a trace. He asked in return, "What Leto?" Brando acted as if he did not know anything, but his heart was in a perilous situation. Which faction did Turst ask him this question from? The nobles? The white main army? Or the unifying guild? All of them were possible, but none of them were supported by the core evidence. But the problem was, how much did they know? Brando forced himself to stare into Turst's eyes. This was his specialty. He had fooled many top players in Madara in the game, but it seemed to have lost its effect this time. Turst did not find any clues from the youth's actions, but it was precisely because of this that his suspicions were raised. He smiled. Your answer doesn't mean much to me. To me, killing you is the easiest way. But your performance has made me appreciate your talent. I don't mind what you say, but you know that it doesn't mean anything to me. Turst looked at him with his glassy purple eyes and smiled. You're Brando, right? I only have one question for you. Are you willing to join us? Brando wanted to play dumb and ask, you? However, he couldn't help but gulp when he saw the other party's hand on the sword and the pitch-black ringed serpent on his finger. He knew that Turst was giving him an ultimatum. He had to either agree or report to Lady Martha. But joining the Unifying Guild was a torment for Brando. In his previous life, the Unifying Guild was second only to Madara. And that was not the most important thing. Brando knew that once he joined this notorious organization, he would be branded with their mark for life. This was not the path he wanted to take. As long as he was not at a dead end, he would not even consider this path. But joining the Unifying Guild and Turst's sword, he had to choose a side. Brando could not help but stop his actions. Dead silence. P.S. Shouldn't a patient be resting after visiting his family and friends every day? My word count is a bit low these few days, but I'll try my best to make up for it after I'm done with my work. Chapter 128. Brando sat on the chair and faced Turst. He looked hesitant, but his mind was clear. It seemed that All for One was suspecting his relationship with Red Copper Dragon Leto and his gang. Although he didn't know how this guy recognized him, at least some news still reached these people's ears. And the timing was much earlier than he had expected. Brando knew that the main goal of these villains was to overthrow authority. The country, the royal family, and the government were all their enemies. Their interest in Reto's group was probably because All for One was interested in their influence among the refugees gathered in the south of Brags. He couldn't help but smile. If that was the case, he knew that he had won. The Viscount from the Manowir region had his life as the bargaining chip, and the bargaining chip in his hand was the people's hearts that All for One wanted to control. It was hard to say which was more important. But with Brendel's experience in the Amber Sword, he would not show his price on his face like a rash newbie. He knew that his advantage was that he had the Viscount's trump card. So he wouldn't give up this advantage so easily. Thinking of this, Brando smiled and took the initiative to lower his stance. Well, you win. Or rather, your sword wins. Lord Viscount of Manowar, Mr. Turst, I've never met you before. Since you're so sure that I'm related to the Red Copper Dragon Leto, why don't we get straight to the point? You want me to join you, but I'm sure that's not the end of it. As he spoke, he secretly gestured to his summoned creatures to be on the lookout. It was a small trick. Brando knew that his actions couldn't be hidden from the Viscount, but it didn't matter. Planeswalkers and their summoned creatures had a spiritual connection. Brando just wanted to let the Viscount see it. Gestures could send the right message, but they could also send the wrong message. After receiving Brando's order, the two mercenaries standing behind the young noble immediately gestured to the others. They took out their battle axes and quietly approached the door. These warriors were summoned from the card and represented the concept of the mercenaries of Lopez. They had all the strengths of the legendary mercenaries: unity, bravery, loyalty, and excellent tactical skills. Turst had one hand on his rapier. His attention was mainly on Brando, but he didn't let go of the others. When the mercenaries moved, his heart skipped a beat. He couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. These mercenaries were as strong as the rumors said. No wonder they could kill their way out of Madara's army. Brando's misdirection immediately took effect, and Turst couldn't help but fall into a trap. From this, he was even more certain that the young man in front of him was related to the mercenaries. Moreover, it was very likely that he was the rumored leader hiding behind the scenes. Turst's guess. But the problem was that it was just a guess. While Turst continued to believe in his hypothesis, Brando didn't say anything useful. The basis of the conversation was that Brando was the leader of the Reto's group. If Turst woke up from his self-confidence, he would have realized that Brando's words didn't support his hypothesis at all. It was just that Brendel had taken advantage of the Viscount's confidence to turn the tables in the previous confrontation without leaving a trace. Brando looked at Turst nervously, afraid that the Viscount would object or even stab him with his rapier. But in the end he let out a sigh of relief. At least some of the rumors in the Amber Sword were credible. The Viscount was indeed a smart and self-centered person. Terst did not have Brendel's ability to manipulate people's minds like he was using a cheat code. Instead, he smiled with a hint of approval in his purple glassy eyes. The fact that the Viscount was willing to admit his identity was a sign of sincerity. The Unifying Guild didn't mind promising generous terms as long as they were absolutely loyal. You're not wrong. So what do you think we should do? The young noble put down his rapier and asked calmly. Brando secretly broke out in cold sweat. This guy is really hard to deal with. He grabbed the armrest of the chair and replied without batting an eyelid, I think any normal person in this position would want to know what this person is trying to do. You know, there are tens of thousands of refugees south of Braggs, and the nobles are slow to react. These people are like a barrel of gunpowder ready to explode at any moment. Well said, Terst praised. What's your goal? What goal do I have? I just want to find a place to farm and upgrade my base. Brando rolled his eyes in his mind. He didn't know how to answer the question, so he slyly asked, What is your goal? Whatever the Unifying Guild can do, I will do. Terst smiled and replied politely. There were not many people who knew about the Krite Ring of All for One and the real constitution of the organization, but there were many who had heard of the name of the organization. In fact, the Unifying Guild's notorious name had already spread throughout the Abyssal Sea. They had caused several tragedies in several places, and every time they were mentioned, people would turn pale. However, compared to how the commoners described the Unifying Guild as the incarnation of the devil, in the eyes of the nobles, the members of the Unifying Guild were more like venomous snakes that reeked of sulfur. This was because the actions of the Unifying Guild's members were intolerable to any traditional organization. They represented the most primitive form of evil. Brando naturally understood this point. However, he pretended to be understanding and laughed. So, in general, we are not on the same side. However, on this matter we can reach an agreement. His answer didn't match his thoughts. Terst turned around to look at the other mercenaries, but they all looked indifferent. He believed in his eyes. Even the slightest change in expression couldn't escape his observation. This meant that the young man's followers didn't disagree with his words, which meant that Brando wasn't lying about something. Of course, if Terst knew that these were just Brando's summons, he would have wanted to kill himself with a piece of tofu. Of course, that was if tofu existed in this world. However, he still didn't understand what Brando meant. What do you mean? The best way to deceive others is to make them listen to what they want to hear. It's not that profound, but it's said that beautiful women are good at deceiving others. The best way to deceive others is to make them listen to what they want to hear. It's not that profound, but people say that beautiful women are good at deceiving others. His senior leader was one of the top beauties in the Amber Sword, so her words couldn't be that simple, right? As he thought about these irrelevant things, he cleared up his thoughts. To put it simply, you're going against this country and so am I. But you're idealists and I'm ambitious. It's that simple. He replied half-truthfully. Idealists. Terst's impression of him changed. Looks like we're not on the same side, but I understand what you're trying to say. You don't want to join us and instead you want to rope us in. But All for One doesn't need allies. He rubbed the hilt of his sword with his thumb. Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you? If you kill this dying country, you'll only lose one of its many spies. It's not a big deal. But as long as I'm alive, you might be able to get help from me. Of course it won't be for free. Brando replied from his chair. But you should know that All for One's job isn't to build a new kingdom from the ashes. Terst smiled. Allow me to introduce myself. That's my job. When the old system collapses, a new one will have to build on its corpse. You should know that this is inevitable. It had to be said that Brando was quite talented to be able to lie without batting an eyelid. How bold of you. The young noble couldn't help but clap his hands. Erwin has gathered forces from all over the place, and the nobles there are scheming to gain more independence. But I'm sure they didn't expect a young man like you to spout such nonsense. Let me ask you, what do you plan to use to replace the centuries of House Corvado's rule? Brando smiled confidently, but it couldn't hide his lack of confidence. However, Terst did not expect that the person in front of him was just a bluff, and his first impression was the strongest. Gamblers don't have the confidence to win. When the reward is high enough, the only thing left is courage. You should know that risk has never been tested in the hands of a fugitive. Brando's expression didn't change as he replied with a merchant's proverb. If the Roman were here, he would have wholeheartedly agreed with this saying, but she didn't have a systematic understanding of it. She was like a curious little animal that relied on her instincts to detect danger. But if that's the case, aren't we doing something useless? Turst crossed his arms and leaned forward. The we he spoke of was none other than All for One. All for One's goal was to return to chaos, but Brando clearly told him that order was always in a cycle of destruction and self-improvement. Do you think I would do something that doesn't benefit me? He asked. When a country falls into civil strife, civilization will decline. Isn't that your goal? Brando used his unparalleled understanding of All for One to hit the nail on the head. Turst's expression changed slightly. Seems like you know us well. I know all my potential friends and enemies. Brando replied with a double entendre. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead as he understood that success or failure depended on this. On the other hand, the Viscount from Manowar couldn't help but fall into deep thought for the first time. His condescending attitude was long gone, and for the first time he felt that this young man wasn't as simple as he thought. He didn't believe Brando's words at all. However, Brando's confidence attracted his attention. Turst's hand was on his sword hilt, and he knew that most of the cases in history had proven that allowing a tiger to return to the mountains was a disaster. But what threat could this young man pose to him? Actually, I have another question. Have you ever been to Pine Castle? Turst raised his head and asked out of curiosity. Brando's expression changed. He was worried that Turst would find out that he was the one who killed the high-ranking member of All for One in Pine Castle. Although he had a natural advantage of being a Black Iron-ranked fighter, it was hard for others to suspect him. However, the world wasn't absolute. He didn't pay attention to the ring when he killed the man, and the members of All for One were able to sense his presence. Before he could finish his thoughts, Turst's sword was already thrusting towards him. You found out? Brando felt a chill in his heart. He instinctively activated charge, but immediately suppressed the urge to counterattack. That was because he was able to see Turst's sword clearly after his speed increased by tenfold. Normal people wouldn't be as familiar with the direction of a sword as Brando was, but he could tell that Turst was probing him. Sure enough, the cold gleaming sword pierced into the back of the chair beside him with a cheese sound. Brando couldn't help but break out in cold sweat. Middle iron ranked, Turst muttered in a barely audible voice, frowning. Looks like he's not that trash's match. But strange, what a coincidence. In this room, only Brando and Turst understood what he was talking about. Brando didn't say a word, but he was cursing Turst in his mind for doubting his strength. Turst sheathed his sword and looked at the young man. How much trouble can you cause for the nobles of Braggs in the near future? He asked. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 129. Chaos. Badam sat on a thick tree stump. It was probably an elm or beech tree, a common tree in Grimoires. He sneezed as he stepped on the roots of the tree. The veteran mercenary rubbed his nose and raised his head in disbelief. There was an abandoned lumber mill in the outskirts of Braggs, and there were sparse tree stumps at the edge of the forest. Most of the lumber came from the upper reaches of the Pine River, and the people here stopped the drifting logs and processed them. A corner of the lumber mill was hidden behind a pine forest not far away, and only the corner of the building could be seen from this direction. It was close to the time when the first moon rose and the first wave of magic. The Matatanians called it the slumber of all things. Planeswalkers could only use blue, black, gray, green, and white cards during this period. Usually they would set up defenses and prepare for a counterattack. When the silver crescent moon appeared in the sky above the pine forest, Brando saw the last few birds flapping their wings as they flew through the shadows of the forest. Then there was silence and only the sounds of owls could be heard. The city of Brugloss was already far to the north. Standing at the edge of the forest and looking towards the north, along the gray hills in the north, there was a bright light, as if the stars in the sky had fallen on the dark earth, forming a dazzling net of pearls. The lights were brilliant. Brando was not unfamiliar with this place. When he was young, he would practice swordsmanship with his grandfather here every morning. To another soul, this place would become the den of a local brotherhood of thieves 7 years later. Later, the Princess Regent suppressed the illegal merchants, and the underground auction market in the city was moved to this place. But that was something that happened many days later, and there was a faded yellowish color in his memory just like an old photo. What made Brando a little confused was that he could not tell if the memory was before or after. Amandina stood in the night, a little uneasy. She wore a beautiful moon-white dress. She had never been to the outskirts of Braggs so late in the night. Of course, when she was still the daughter of a noble family, she didn't often participate in the excursions of other noble ladies. Amandina always thought that she was a bit of a loner, but at the same time she pridefully believed that it was because she was more knowledgeable than the other girls. She stared at the silver moon above the pine forest. The dark forest made her nervous, but there was also a hint of curiosity. It was as if the romance of an adventurer and the thrill of pursuing the unknown had taken root in her heart. It made her want to continue to stay with these people. This kind of life was both novel and full of unknowns to her. She took a deep breath to calm herself down and continued Badam's words. If Turst isn't testing us, I'm afraid that the Unifying Guild is plotting something and needs us to attract the attention of the nobles. Of course, I think it's more likely that it's a combination of both. That's good, my lord. It's best that we don't have anything to do with those demons in human skin. Badam sat on the tree stump and said loudly, now that the bastard in the noble skin is not here, he can't threaten any of us. Didn't my lord say that you want to go to Randner? Let's go there together. Let's go far away and see what he can do to us. Amandina heard Badam's words and looked at Brando. She only found out today that Brando's true identity was not only a high-ranking member of the mercenary group, but also the mastermind behind the scenes. This made the young man even more mysterious in her eyes. But what made her even more determined was that Turst, who had been secretly searching for her, was actually a member of the Unifying Guild. The Erewhon organization in the Sea of Abyss was not as simple as it seemed. Amandina's face turned pale when she heard that name. Amandina did not think that Brando would lie to her, but this young knight did not seem to have the need to. Amandina quickly saw Brando shaking his head. Brando retracted his gaze from his stats. With his rich knowledge and experience in the game, he had already figured out the Planeswalker class. Or rather, it should be said that the Planeswalker class was not a class. He saw that he still only had a few identities and professions: mercenary, militia, commoner, and scholar. This meant that the Planeswalker itself wasn't counted as a profession. It couldn't even be counted as an identity or a secondary profession. Brando thought for a moment and understood the meaning of this existence. The core of the Planeswalker class was the Cards of Fate, and it should be a large and unique system of items. Players could use this system to simulate and realize the abilities of any class. In other words, this thing was a set of rules that were outside of the original rules in the game. Even though it looked very strong, if every player could grasp it, it would not be considered as a ridiculous ability. Of course, if there were only geniuses, why would it not exist in the original game but appear in this world? But what made Brando feel a little strange was that it was clear that this system of items had the ability to grow, and this growth was not limited to relying on more cards to achieve it, but was closely related to the holder's personal ability. He found that when he was only level 10 he only had 4 cards in his hand. But when he reached level 13, the number of cards in his hand had increased to 5, and the red, gold, and gray elements in the elemental pool that represented the night deck had increased by 1 slot. But at this time he heard Badam's words. Badam's words could be said to be his thoughts in a certain way, but Brando knew that he could not think about this problem at this time. He was no longer the simple player he used to be. He had already realized that perhaps getting involved with All for One might be a decision that was beneficial to him. Of course, he did not want to wallow in the mire with those who did not care about human lives. On the contrary, he was thinking about how to play as a spy. So he shook his head. What? Badam hesitated for a moment and said hesitantly, My lord, you want to work with them? But those people are not good people, they have never had a good reputation. Amandina originally wanted to say something, but now she did not say anything. Brando's decision made her sigh in relief. In fact, she wanted to remind Brando that All for One's power was not small. If Turst was willing to let him leave, then there must be a backup plan. She didn't want the Amber Sword mercenary group to make a strong enemy before they even left Grinnoir's. As Brando's aide, she had subconsciously seen the mercenary band as the young knight's private property. Of course I know who those people are, Badam. But you have to consider the consequences. Since I proposed this to that guy, I will not say a lie that will be exposed immediately. Brando said to Badam. Then don't we have to incite the refugees to riot? Badam could not help but scratch his head, a little reluctant. Of course not, Brando will definitely have a way. It's like this, when we were in Bucci we called him the Almighty Brando. The little Roman stood by the river and bent down to pick up stones to play with the water. When she heard Badam's words she could not help but turn around and say, Since when did you give me such a nickname in Bucci? Brando glanced at the little brat and could not help but think in annoyance. But the little Roman's current actions did not match her current clothes and temperament at all. She and Amandina had changed their clothes. Their original set of clothes had already been ruined in the chaos at the auction house. The little Roman did not bring any change of clothes. During the journey, Brando bought a few sets of clothes for her from a nearby merchant's house. The merchant girl had been hiding them like a treasure. But this time she temporarily wore a dress from Amandina's house. The little Roman wore a black dress with gold trimmings that matched her slender waist very well. Only the bottom part of the dress revealed a circle of white-laced petticoats. Originally, when she walked, she had her own unique temperament, full of confidence. She raised her head and puffed out her chest. Her well-developed bosom showed a beautiful curve under the tight tunic dress. Amandina felt a burst of jealousy looking at her. But Amandina specially tied her light brown hair up and put on a flower accessory. When the little merchant girl walked out of the room, she proudly twirled around Brando and smiled sweetly at him. Even now, Brando was still a little dazed when he saw her. But she looked very much like the female merchants in the port of Amberlight. But no one of that status would roll up their sleeves, reveal their white arms, and bend over to carefully pick up the stones on the riverbank to see which one could fly farther on the water. In fact, Brando did not even understand why this girl had to wear such troublesome clothes when she came to the wilderness. Of course, the answer to this question would probably be, because I am a merchant. This kind of answer did not go through the brain. Badam listened to the Roman's words and looked at Brando in confusion. Brando nodded. In less than half a month, these refugees who have gathered in the south of Brags will have problems. The upcoming celebration will appease them for a while, but in the end, it will not solve the root cause. Those nobles who live well will not understand. Really? This time, Amandina showed a look of curiosity. Brando nodded. The August riot was not a big deal in history. But it was enough to provide an answer to Terst, and it did not take much effort for them to do so. Brando did not have the intention to stop the riot, and he did not have the power to do so. The refugees needed space to survive, and settling them down was a difficult task. The nobles were not willing to take up this burden, and no one could take it up. There were tens of thousands of mouths to feed. Badam opened his mouth. He did not expect this complicated problem to be solved so easily by Brando. He could not help but turn to look at Amandina. Amandina was faintly worried. She was not like the careless red-bearded mercenary who only had the simplest line of thinking. She always felt that Brando seemed to know more than any of them. Brando saw Roan and his men coming out of the dark forest, and his spirits lifted. He sent Roan to investigate the situation in the city, and it seemed like there was some progress. As expected, Roan and the two short burglars came out of the bushes and said to Brando, "We've investigated it thoroughly. It was indeed those trash who neglected their duties. The undead disguised themselves as merchants and entered the city." "Who was it?" Brando asked. "A cavalry captain called Carancado." Roan replied. He wanted to say something, but he saw Brando shaking his head. Brando happened to know this Carancado because he was the future commander of the silver-winged cavalry of the White Mane army. "This guy is from the royal faction." Brando muttered to himself. "So that's how it is. Neglecting their duties is not as simple as it seems." He could not help but think of the fire seeds at the auction. This matter was probably related to the royal faction. Everything that happened in Brags and the Amber Sword was later covered up, or else Brando would not have known about it. This meant that there was an unknown power behind this. The royal faction was playing with fire. Brando could not help but break out in cold sweat when he thought of the cause and effect of this. Only Oberg VII could think of this. Wasn't this inviting a wolf into the house? Fortunately, Incersta's dragon intent was not in Grimoires, or else the situation in the south of Erewhon would be ruined. Of course, he could not help but think that Oberg VII could have caused the situation in the south to deteriorate to the point that it could not be worse. P.S. Whether you think this book is uninspired, or have no expectations for this book, please stop reading. Leaving comments in the book review section every few days even if you are not disgusted, I am. Regarding the issue of automatic saving compared to Word, I am more used to Notepad. Lastly, I would like to emphasize that those who do not have high expectations for this book can stop reading. Thank you for your cooperation. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. Chapter 130. Scene 59, The Last Night of Brags, Part 1. No matter what, the setting sun of Aween had sowed the seeds of its internal strife. King Oberg VII gradually realized that he was getting old and that his strength was not as great as he wished. He was eager to clear the way for the new king to ascend to the throne, so he could not help but take action. After all, his greatest threat was the two rebellious duchies in the south of the kingdom. Brando knew that King Oberg VII ascended to the throne at the age of 93. This king had great ambitions when he was young, and he wanted to emulate his grandfather Anson XI. That was when the militia and guards were first established, and when the central power of Erewhon was at its peak. However, the world was not in his control. Even though Oberg VII had witnessed the arrogance of the local nobles, and the young Duke Erek even threatened his father, Oberg VI, to change the defense laws, these memories left a deep impression in the king's heart. However, he lacked Anson XI's ability to use both kindness and power. Moreover, during Anson XI's reign, Erewhon had no internal or external threats. The royal family could even control the local armies, and the current turbulent times could not compare. In the cold night of Bragg's outskirts, the wind gradually picked up. The wind, which came from the sea, followed the path of the northern ridges of the Kalanga Mountains, passed through the hills and mountains of Randner, and carried with it the scents of the woods and the rivers of that long journey, which penetrated deeply into the lungs of everyone on the fringes of the forest. Roman stood barefoot in the water, and she could not help but raise her head and squint her eyes, letting the wind caress her smooth forehead. The smell of the wind here is exactly the same as in Bucci, Brando? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She could not help but exclaim in surprise. Amandina also took a deep breath, but she coughed instead. Brando glanced at her and then raised his head, just in time to see the night wind carrying a dark cloud from the west, covering a large patch of stars. It was as if the kingdom's dark future was foretold. Brando didn't feel heavy at all. Instead, there was a kind of excitement that swept through every nerve ending in his body. To him, the impending chaos was also an opportunity. Could he participate in this history and rely on his meager strength to change the heavy and cold history that seemed to be engraved on a stone slab? This was not a fantasy, but a signal to urge him to take action. Brando seemed to have smelled a hint of warning in the air. He turned his head, and there was a faint flush of excitement on his fair face. He asked, "Did you get the money?" Although Cripple didn't understand why a simple piece of news could make Brando go into a daze, he realized that he couldn't see through this young man anymore. At the auction house, he had seen with his own eyes how Brando had killed the powerful spiritual servant. That was not the skill of an ordinary person. Now that he thought about it, he could only attribute it to the fact that he was the descendant of that old thing. He couldn't help but look at Brando again and then answered with sincerity, "The money is in our hands. Brando, I followed your orders and moved the money to a safe place." "The auction house compensated you?" Cripple was shocked and nodded hurriedly. Brando knew that Bragg's underground auction house was backed by the local nobles. This was an open secret. That was why he wasn't worried that he would suffer unnecessary losses. To these people, reputation and face were more important than money. "How much money do we have in total?" Brando asked. Cripple stretched out his hand and made a count. Excluding the money they used, there were still 2.5 billion tor left. Brando looked at it and saw Amandina walking over with his shoes. He looked at Badam and Amandina who were sitting at the side and replied, "That's good too. Our business in Bragg's has come to an end." In reality, Brando's original plan still had some details to be perfected. For example, there was a quest in the noble's library that allowed him to obtain a low-level skill book. Another example was the quest in the Cross Star, and that gave him a permanent increase of 1 energy rank to the Golden Wine. It was a pity that these quests could not be completed in a day. Brando estimated that it would take him a month to complete them in the game, and it would only be slower here. As a player who strived for perfection, he should have stayed to reap all the benefits. However, the sudden change in the situation in Bragg's and the presence of the Unifying Guild made him realize that it was not a good idea to stay here for long. As soon as this warning appeared, Brando reacted as quickly as possible. He had already decided to leave this place and head east or south. He would go deep into the mountains of Randner, pass through the Tisandika forest, and follow the northern ridge of the Karana Mountains to search for his treasure. Where are we going? Although Badam was clamoring to leave this troublesome place, he was still a little worried when it came to it. Even though he was a mercenary, the furthest he had gone was Karsuk. But according to Brendel's explanation, they might have to cross Randner and reach the shores of the Sea of Stars, where they would be able to see the towering mountain that the poet spoke of. Following that path, they would have to enter the wilderness. Legend has it that after passing through the Tisandika forest under the mountain, or following the Silver Beach to the east, there would be an endless desert. The people of Karsuk lived here for a long time, and in their stories, there were some countries to the east of the desert. For example, the most famous legend, the land of pearls, the kingdom of the 9 phoenixes. We will split into 2. Batum, you will bring Cripple back to the group, and let Reto bring everyone to a place called Gree. To get there you will need to hire a guide. The safest route for now is the road to the north of Randner. Nominally, you only need to use the banner of a mercenary to not cause any trouble. Brando thought for a while and replied. Gree, where is that place? That is the easternmost port of the kingdom, Brando smiled. The scenery there is not bad and the local girls are simple and warm. Batum, you might find a girl you like there. Batum blushed and muttered, I am a mercenary who is always wandering, my lord. That was in the past. Now you are my retainer. Brando did not mind at all. The red-bearded mercenary immediately shut his mouth, but his face showed a look of yearning. Even if he was a little reluctant before, he was now eager to give it a try. What about you, my lord? He thought for a while and asked again. I have some personal matters to attend to. Brando thought of the thorn of light that he had lost in the auction house and felt it was a pity. However, that sword had gradually lost its luster after reaching level 20, so it was necessary to change to another weapon. In fact, his equipment and strength did not improve at all in the past month, which was a far cry from his original plan. Of course, Braggs's preparations were necessary. As the saying goes, sharpening the axe will not delay the work of cutting firewood. Brando's actions were already fast enough, but he was not satisfied with it. Especially after his encounter with Terst, he felt the need to increase his strength. Therefore, at that time he had made a mental note of this adventure. His goal was still the Dusty Kingdom, but before that he had to verify the words of the White Knight Ebden. Brando did not dare to let his guard down when it came to the Lionheart sword. However, he needed to use the Sage Slate to make the Stone Sage speak. Brando did not have any hopes for the Sage Slate that would reach Braggs in a few days. Putting aside the fact that he did not have enough time, he did not have the money of 500,000 Tor right now. But it's fine. I'll just go and get a Sage Slate. He knew that there were a few dungeons in the game that would drop it. The closest ones were Randner, Grinoires, the Misty Forest at the border of Erek, the ruins of the Necromancer's Temple, and the Dragon's Canyon. These places were suitable for him to go on an adventure at his level, and he only needed to prepare a little. Brando also knew that he needed to increase his strength, and this was killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Brando said that he had personal matters to attend to, so Batum did not say anything. His thoughts had already flown to Gree. Brando's description of that place made his heart itch. He had never seen the sea in his life. Brando turned back and asked, Roman, what about you? What are your plans? Are you coming with me, or are you staying behind to take care of the celebration? Romaine tilted her head and answered as if it was a matter of course. Of course I'm going with Brando. But the light in her eyes clearly said that she was going to take the risk. Roman was going to take the risk. You're not going to earn money? Brando was surprised and could not help but touch her forehead to see if she had a fever. Of course not. Roman slapped his hand away and said proudly, Lord Roman has already arranged everything here. I've already handed it over to Sue, and the rest is just waiting for the funds to come in. So? Brando was stunned. He remembered the girl who looked at him with a cold face, and felt like he owed her 1,000,000 Tor. Isn't that the Reto's daughter? Yes. Roman nodded. She's here to look for Freya. I'm Freya's best friend, so of course I can ask Sue for a little help. You're really not worried about people. Brendel could not help but smack her on the head. This action had become a habit for him recently. Roman immediately smiled like a little fox. If that's the case, I'll stay as well. Amandina suddenly said, This is part of my job anyway. Brando stopped and looked at her. You can't stay. Mother Marcia Buff. Amandina and the future master alchemist, Tamar, are the most valuable assets I have right now. He could not leave these 2 people in Braggs no matter what. He had to take them with him for safety's sake. Tamar had to bring his heavy alchemy equipment, so he could only let him go with Reto and the others. And in the spirit of not putting all eggs in one basket, he had to let Amandina go with him. If Roman was with him, at least there would be another girl who could take care of Amandina. Terst is still here and you know his identity. The Unifying Guild is not an ordinary person. It's too dangerous for you to stay here. Come with me and I'll let Roman take care of you. He thought for a moment and replied. How can I do that? Amandina was stunned. She had a trace of yearning for an adventurous life, but she knew that she could not adapt to such a life. For a girl like her, adventuring was just a beautiful dream that existed in her dreams. Some people would follow their impulsive thoughts, but Amandina was not such a person. But just as she began to hesitate, Romaine's words shattered her reservations. Of course you can, Amandina. Adventuring is very interesting. Amandina could not help but look at Brando. Brando nodded. There's no need to say any more. Everyone go and prepare. We'll split up and enter the city. I'm afraid that Terst will come looking for trouble again. Before the last star disappears, we'll gather at the east gate. Everyone nodded in agreement. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 131. The heavy wooden door with gilded patterns slowly opened. The air started to move and a low rumbling sound pierced through the eardrums. It was as if an ancient kingdom was opening its doors to visitors. The light outside the hall gradually became brighter. Behind the door stood a girl with an angry expression. The half-elf princess was wearing a silver-white princess dress. The hem of the dress was fringed with flouncy leaves, and it reached all the way to the marble floor. She held her head high and her chest puffed out. Her silvery curls fell over her shoulders, and her hands were crossed on the lining of her dress. She stood there with a cold expression on her face as she stared at the people who were slowly walking out from the shadows. The deep marble floor set off her beauty. She was like a lily blooming in the dark. Your Highness. Marquis Kluge, who was walking at the front, had a surprised smile on his gloomy face. This important minister who had served the house of Covardo since Nan's era put his hands under his ribs and bowed deeply. He raised his head and his lips curled up slightly. His thin face seemed to always have a trace of a mocking smile. You're welcome, Marquis. The girl did not even look at the old fox. She looked straight ahead and asked coldly, Is father inside? I'm sorry, Your Highness. His Majesty is receiving the ambassador of Madara. I'm afraid he can't see you for the time being. Kluge replied with a smile. Erwin's eldest daughter had a worried look on her face, but she quickly recovered. Then I'll wait here. She raised her head and replied, It's late. The ambassador of Madara won't stay for long. Your Highness, please take care of yourself. Marquis Kluge looked at the proud flower of the royal family. His eyes were filled with admiration, but he still had a fake smile on his face. Thank you for your concern. Then I'll take my leave. Please. The girl's pale silver eyes did not move as she watched these people leave. But when Marquis Kluge, who was wearing a purple gold official's robe, passed by her, the eldest daughter of Erwin suddenly said, Marquis Kluge, you're playing with fire. You're on your own now. Marquis Kluge was slightly startled. The princess' words carried a serious warning. The trusted minister of King Oberg VII stopped in his tracks and thought of something. A gloomy smile appeared on his face. Your Highness, what are you talking about? He asked. You know what I'm talking about. I can't stop what happened in the city of Brags and Fort Corco, but don't forget whose side the Holy Cathedral of Fire is on in Erwin. The princess replied coldly. Kluge's expression changed slightly, but he quickly returned to normal. This old fox was extremely shrewd. He took a deep breath and replied with a fake smile, Thank you for your reminder, Your Highness. Neither side seemed to be willing to continue the conversation. Marquis Kluge and his entourage left in a hurry. A young man behind the Marquis asked, Lord Marquis, what does she mean? This flower of the royal family can't be underestimated, Wilma. Marquis Kluge replied with a gloomy face, Although we're in a good situation now, she's not idle either. According to the news from outside, this princess is using the Church of Havel to raise money. Although I don't know what she wants to do, I'm sure she'll make a move. Marquis Kluge turned his head to look at the dark night sky outside the arched windows of the corridor and said, Today she's here to remind us of this. But if she can do this, it means that our princess still has some concerns. She's afraid of breaking the vases. He sighed and rubbed the ring on his glove. On the pitch-black ring tray, an Ouroboros seemed to have come to life as it coiled around the tray, its edges reflecting a faint bronze light. Everyone was silent. The half-fairy princess watched Marquis Kluge and his entourage leave without saying a word. When she turned back, she saw Sir Benninger in a light golden robe walking out from the shadows behind one of the pillars in the hall. How was it? The girl waited for him to come closer and immediately asked. The young man shook his head bitterly, Not good, Your Highness. I still haven't seen His Majesty. The girl's face became calm. Your Highness? Tonight I'm going back to my territory. Take Hazel with you and come with me. The girl stared ahead and replied calmly, Be careful, don't attract the attention of those people. Your Highness, is there no other way? Benninger asked with a bitter face. He was the youngest son of Duke Cypher and had an extremely high status. But ever since he met Princess Griffin a year ago, he was shocked by her beauty. Since then, he had submitted to the charm of this half-fairy princess and was willing to follow her everywhere. Benninger had stayed in the capital for longer than a young nobleman expected. His father had sent him letters urging him to return home and inherit his fief, but the young man still lingered in the capital, forgetting to return home. Everyone knew that the one who held this young man's heart was only the eldest princess of the Erewhon royal family. Princess Griffin turned 16 in July, which was the age for the royal family to talk about marriage. However, Oberg VII loved her very much. He would rather have her accompany him for 2 more years. Besides, Oberg VII also understood that his youngest son, Hazel, was a coward and needed the help of his sister. However, this was actually a good thing for Benninger. He knew deep down that there was no possibility between him and the princess. The longer she stayed with Oberg, the longer he could stay with her. Of course, it wasn't that he didn't feel sorry for himself. If he was the eldest son of Duke Cypher instead of the youngest, things would be different. But now the girl's words made his heart beat faster. The princess said that she wanted to return to her territory. This was a great opportunity. In the history of the Erewhon royal family, there weren't many cases where a direct descendant of the royal family returned to their territory, but every time they did, something terrible would happen. Benninger looked at the princess, his heart filled with anticipation and fear for the unknown future. He couldn't decide what to do. He felt that if they left, it wouldn't be just a simple storm in Erewhon. Under the dim candlelight, the 16-year-old Erewhon royal princess's firm gaze contrasted with the young man's hesitant expression. The hall was silent for a moment. "What are you worried about, Benninger?" "I have some worries. His Majesty he." The young man didn't know how to express his thoughts. In fact, ever since June, or to be exact, ever since Madara's envoy arrived, other than Prime Minister Kluge, none of Oberg VII's trusted subordinates had seen him. Even his daughter and son were forcefully grounded, and their movements were limited to the royal capital. The news of Oberg VII's house arrest spread like wildfire, but it didn't cause much of a reaction among the nobles. Ever since Oberg VII appointed Kluge as his prime minister, his trust in him grew day by day. Kluge's faction held a lot of power in the royal court, which was a fact that everyone knew. However, this faction never had any contact with the local government, which was why Oberg VII trusted them so much. As a result, the royal faction allowed them to do as they pleased. Kluge's administration and strategy were impeccable, and he was hailed as the greatest politician of the Corvado dynasty since Anson XI. Some people even compared him to Poix, the archbishop of the Church of Havel during the time of Anson XI. However, the situation took a turn for the worse after 4 or 5 months. Kluge seemed to have the intention to seize power, and with the War of the Black Rose raging like wildfire, Erewhon's internal politics seemed to be in a precarious situation. However, doubts and suspicions didn't only spread among the nobles. However, the core figures of the royal faction, Oberway and Everton, were on their way to deal with Madara. The only remaining figure of the Church of Havel, the most prestigious of the 3, was also in seclusion. As a result, the situation in the royal capital seemed to be even more gloomy. However, at this time, the eldest daughter of the royal family of Erewhon proposed to return to her own territory. Not to mention whether or not they could escape from this big cage, but how could this princess bear to leave her father behind? The relationship between Princess Griffin and her father was recognized by the world. Benninger, as a close vassal of the princess, knew this better than anyone else. However, the half-elf girl's expression didn't change. She replied quietly, "With my father's personality, he would never agree to such a ridiculous agreement with Madara. Although I still don't know what Kluge's goal is, one thing is clear. We can't do anything here. First of all, I have to send my brother out. This is one of my responsibilities. I have to be one step ahead. Everything is for the benefit of the royal family. If anything happens to my father, I think he will understand." "Your Highness." The young man stared blankly at the half-elf girl who was a head shorter than him. It was as if she wasn't 16 years old, but a mature and outstanding politician. Griffin glanced at him and said, "Don't worry, Benninger, I am not unprepared. With the help of my teacher's connections, we can still play our own game. Don't forget that I have never trusted Kluge. They wouldn't dare to harm my father." The princess suddenly stopped talking. She saw the gloomy face of Madara's envoy walk out of the door. At this moment, the living and the dead looked at each other. Then they passed by each other. However, when Erewhon's royal capital was in a state of chaos, Brando, who was well aware of this, was sitting leisurely in the Cross Star Bar in the White Swan district of Braggs. He was asking the bartender about the golden wine. Every once in a while he would look at the wind-up clock hanging on the wine rack. It was almost 12 o'clock. Brando didn't expect to be lucky enough to get the clue of this continuous quest overnight and complete it easily. He was just waiting for someone and looking for something to pass the time. When the church's bell rang 12 times, the door of the bar was finally pushed open. Outside the door stood a girl wearing a dark blue military uniform. Her long ponytail was tied behind her head. Her face was slightly red and she looked at him with a light brown and bright eyes. Freya seemed to be an official knight. She was wearing a formal knight's belt and a cross-hilt sword issued by the church on her waist. She also wore a pair of shiny riding boots. She looked like a heroic female knight. However, her concerned expression betrayed her. She looked around as soon as she entered the bar, and her eyes fell on Brando. She took a deep breath and immediately asked, "Are you leaving, Brando?" "Yes." Freya was silent. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 132. Freya fell silent. She seemed to be thinking absent-mindedly for a while, then raised her head to look at him, her light brown eyes deep like a pair of brown gemstones. The young knight raised her left hand, hesitated for a moment, and then took off the ring on her index finger. "Brando, wear this ring. Outside you need it more than I do." Brando was slightly startled. He looked at the fireball ring, the bright ruby shining under the candlelight. He then looked at Freya, who turned her head slightly and said, "This ring originally belonged to you. I'm just borrowing it temporarily, have you forgotten?" At this time, the bartender who had been chatting with him stood up and patted the young man's shoulder, smiling. "Buddy, looks like you're in a bit of trouble. I'll go do something first. I'll tell you about the legend of the wine glass later." After saying that, the bartender picked up the glass and walked to the other side of the bar to deal with a few drunk mercenaries. The young knight with a long ponytail saw this scene and could not help but close her mouth subconsciously, unable to say a word. Brando shook his head and smiled, but the faint smile on his face could not hide the warmth in his heart. He looked at Freya, once again feeling the weight of the word partner in his heart. He had originally only left a message for Freya, but he did not expect this stubborn girl from the countryside of Bucci to insist on seeing him after seeing the Roman. Of course, he knew that she did not come just to give him the ring, but to show her concern for him. Freya's heart was in a mess. She clenched her fists. When she first heard that Brando and the others were leaving, she only had one thought in her mind. Even if she ran out of nowhere, she just wanted to see everyone. That feeling was like a child who could not leave the adults. After calming down, she only felt her face burning. She had been thinking about this problem. She wanted to go to Erwin's Royal Cavalry Academy alone, leaving everyone, especially Brando. Could she really do what Brando said to her? He had the power to protect little Ferris and everyone else. Freya felt that her heart was filled with uncertainty and doubt about the uncertain future. Brando was like a life-saving straw in front of her, but when it came down to it, she didn't dare to reach out and grab him tightly. The female knight stared at the corner of Brando's clothes in a daze. Of course, Brando saw through her thoughts, because Freya's thoughts were written all over her face. He smiled and reached out his hand to take the ring. The female knight was slightly stunned. She raised her head and asked, You accepted it?" "Of course. How could I refuse a ring from the goddess of war?" Brando laughed. However, he knew in his heart that Freya wouldn't encounter any danger in the Wangli Knight Academy. Moreover, he really needed every bit of strength he could muster. If that wasn't the case, he definitely wouldn't have accepted this ring just to make Freya feel at ease. Valkyrie? In my hometown there's a story about the Valkyrie. The legendary Valkyrie was heroic and cool. She sat on a warhorse, holding a swallow-tailed flag in one hand and a long sword in the other, leading her people to victory. She protected her country. Brando looked at her and smiled. He was thinking about another Valkyrie story. At the end of the First Era in Wond, there was a lady on a warhorse, wearing silver armor, and looking at her subordinates with sparkling light brown eyes. Brando remembered that the background was the gray sky of Fort Mar. The broken flag of the Silver Cross Army was hanging weakly on a spear. The female general was riding her beloved horse, Silver Sand. She was shorter than many warriors, but she wasn't much taller than Freya now. At that time, she still had the long ponytail that she had tied behind her head since the Bucci era. The brown ponytail that made people feel warm on the battlefield represented a name that could be relied on. It made everyone feel at ease because that was Freya, Erwin's protector, the Valkyrie. At that time, Freya lowered her head and looked at each of them. She rode her beloved horse in a silver battle robe and slowly walked past each of them. It was drizzling. Her only subordinates were only 100 or so students from the Royal Knight Academy. Many of them were the children of great nobles, and some of them even became their most troublesome enemies. But at that time they were all following behind the female knight. A group of knights in white battle robes followed her all the way into the eyes of these defeated soldiers. When depression, despair, and abjection shrouded their hearts, every player lost their confidence. Erwin was finished. This ruined country was no match for the powerful Madara. They felt sorry for themselves, shook their heads, and sighed about why they were born in such a country. There was no hope, no tomorrow, only the humiliation of failure. But when these young knights appeared, it was like a pure light, like a sharp sword that slowly parted the gloomy clouds in the sky. Brando would never forget that scene for the rest of his life. The female general's first words were, "Soldiers, please turn back and join me. Let's defeat Madara. Please forgive me for not being able to understand your cold, hunger, fear, and pain at this moment, but I can see a deep abjection in you. This abjection, I can feel it. Because at this moment our country has failed. We will retreat and the undead will sweep our homeland. We are the losers no matter how we quibble. We can't choose all of this. This depression suffocates us. Is this really the only thing we can do? Soldiers? No, please turn back. But at least we still have a chance. Let me take you with me to fight again. Please believe in me." She pressed her hand on her chest. "I will fight side by side with you. I am willing to take all the responsibility for this. Follow me, let me die in front of you. Let me use this promise to exchange for the courage of a man." That was the first time the silver lily shone on the battlefield. The legend of the Valkyrie was written into a poem in Erwin that touched countless players. Speaking of this protector of Erwin, perhaps compared to most NPCs, the players had a deeper impression of this name. Because it was she who brought them out of the fate of failure, gave them glory, and made the name Erwin a source of pride. She was their flag, the source of pride for the players of Erwin. They were willing to fight for her because each of them was willing to fight for their own honor. Erwin's war song was composed by an ordinary player who was not famous on the forum, but it was sung by countless people. We are the proud people of Erwin. Even if we fail, we will not lower our noble heads. Our courage is engraved on our swords. Our faith is the flag that protects us. The blood of Erwin flows on the path that we yearn for. What we yearn for, there will be a day when the silver lily flag is raised again. What we yearn for, is the belief of Erwin never to be broken. When we die, the voice of our souls still echoes on this land. It is telling, this is our homeland. The land that we love dearly. Brando lowered his head and rubbed his eyes. When he raised his head again, he saw Freya lowering her head and whispering to him, "How can I do the same thing as the legend, Brando? I am a very stupid girl, I just want to do my best." "Yes. Your best is the root of this legend." The young man looked at her, he admired this kind of serious Freya. Even if it was a small matter, this girl from the countryside of Buchi would do her best to do it. Maybe she did not know what kind of potential she had, but there will be a day when gold shines from the sand at the bottom of the river. He smiled. Just think of it as a dream. Freya looked at him, nodded, and asked, "Is it the legend of the Highland Knight?" Brando nodded. Freya was silent. After a while, she whispered, "Is there anything else you want to tell me, Brando?" "No, wait." Brando hesitated for a moment, then called out to her. He thought for a while and asked, "Freya, what do you think of Erwin?" When Brando said this, he deliberately lowered his voice. In fact, his eyes had already swept across the bar to see if anyone was paying attention to them. "Erwin? What do you think?" The girl was stunned. If the country is compared to a person, Erwin is now like a dying old man. Brando replied. Freya was stunned. In this period of time, she was no longer the naive female militia captain. After seeing the filthy relationship between the nobles, she was full of worry for the people in the upper class who controlled the fate of the country, but she did not understand where the problem was. Was it supposed to be like this? Or did something go wrong? The uneasy girl could only comfort herself that in this world, there was light and there was darkness. Maybe everything would be better, this was just a cycle of history. But in the depths of her heart, she always wanted to know if it was just her naive view of the world in the past. But she did not expect that the first sentence Brando asked her to stay would eliminate all the comforting thoughts in her heart, leaving only the worst one. For a moment, Freya was speechless. Freya, listen to me. Brendel hesitated for a long time before saying that. He was always worried that he would affect the goddess of war's future path. But in the end he made up his mind, because Freya was not only the goddess of war, she was only a shadow in his heart. She was more of a partner that he could trust. He had no real family in this world, and Freya also lost her parents who raised her. In comparison, the two of them needed each other's support more. In fact, ever since that night in the Green Village, Brando understood that his connection with the goddess of war could not be broken. It was like two lonely, weak people relying on each other to move forward in the darkness. Brando found it hard to imagine that without these people in Bucci, he could establish a connection with this world and not feel lonely all the time. And for the current Freya it was the same. Erwin may not be able to return to the peace of the past, only a great change can save this country. Of course, a great change may also tear it apart, but every one of us in this era can only do our best to save it. I don't know how many people can see through this. I don't know how many people can understand what I mean, but Freya, do you understand? The female knight looked at him in a daze, but nodded subconsciously. Do you now understand why I want you to go to the Royal Knight Academy? But Freya, do your best. I don't know if this is true, Brando, but I want to believe in you. Freya took a deep breath and said uneasily, but my mind is in a mess right now. I only feel scared. What about everyone in Bucci? Do we not have a way to change everything? So I will also do my best. Freya, I need your help. The girl looked at him and stopped. What should I do? If anything happens, we'll support Her Highness one-sidedly. I heard that Princess Griffine of Erwin has a good reputation. If there is anyone in the Corvado dynasty who can lead this country out of this predicament, we can only trust her. Brando thought for a moment and replied, at the Royal Knight Academy, I believe you will have a chance to meet her. Brando, why do you know so much? Freya could not help but ask, you are joking with me, right? I also want to, but when you unconsciously become a chess player, whether you like it or not, you can see the big picture. You will understand in the future, Freya. Brando smiled, don't worry too much, we will all meet again. Freya, don't forget what I said, I will stand behind you. The night girl lowered her head and thought for a moment before whispering, I understand, then I will leave. When Freya said those words, she was as lonely as a solitary bird. When she turned around, Brendel had the urge to call out to the girl who came from Bucci. But he resisted in the end. Freya had her own path and he could not be so selfish. But at this time, the girl stopped and turned around. Brando. Yes. Please take care of Roman for me. She's my best friend. After saying this, she walked out of the bar without looking back. Brando was left alone, trying to figure out the meaning of her last sentence. But in the end, the young man just shook his head and picked up the wine glass on the bar counter. P.S. Sorry, there are too many things happening this year, so I don't have the face to say too much. I'll try my best to write more chapters. Chapter 133. The late summer breeze had a hint of sweetness to it, and it was intoxicating under the warm sun. August had passed and October was approaching. The young man reached out his hand towards the blue sky, and his fingers covered his vision. The gentle sunlight flowed through the gaps between his fingers, and the changing rays of light were exceptionally beautiful. Then he sighed and put down his hand. The green mountains of Chablis once again returned to his sight. The air was dry and comfortable, and the weather was clear and pleasant. However, the deep green that covered the mountains had faded a little. Ginkgo, metasequoia, and platanish trees had a layer of light yellow on their leaves, and the fragrant trees in the forest were dyed a light red. The mottled colors were like oil paint that flowed into a palette, and when they blended together, it created a natural beauty that made one's heart flutter. He sat on the back of his horse and held the reins with one hand. He stared at the grayish-white cliff not far away from him. At the intersection of the mountain and the river there was a red roof. That was the town of Chablis. Chablis was not famous in the game, and Brando only knew that it was located in the middle of Ranner. There were a few minorities in Erwin living there, the mountain folk. There was a dense forest to the north of the town, and the ruins of the Silver Elves were hidden under layers of trees. It was called the Berriganesti Girlis Ruins, and it used to be a spacious temple for the Silver Elves. The silver courtyard was built in the middle of the dense forest, and it was connected to a sacred white corridor. It fit the philosophy of the Silver Elves, and it was a mysterious and majestic beauty. However, during the year of the Shadow Dragon, the elves left the area for unknown reasons, and the temple was abandoned. Now, it should be occupied by a group of lizard-men bandits if Brando remembered correctly. In the game, there was no background in this area, and the reason why the players went to the Silver Elves Temple was to plunder the wealth of the lizard-men bandits. Of course, the game designers gave them a more dignified reason, and it was mostly to get rid of evil for the people. Brando felt that it was ridiculous. The players did not need any excuses, but the game designers had to find ways to make the world self-consistent. Thus, they had to find a reason to help the locusts in the game. It was just that other than the plot, it was a thankless task to begin with. But now his thoughts had changed. He realized that the background that he didn't understand before was now shrouded in fog. Brando had never been to Chablis before because there were more than 100 dungeons like the Balaganesti Jurlis ruins in the old Grimoires region. Players did not need to risk their lives in other regions when they were still at low levels. The game designer's thought process was also biased towards this direction. Once players reached a higher level, they would be able to move freely between regions and countries. However, as a veteran player he had more or less heard rumors about these areas. For example, the ruins of the Basilica of St. Gerlis in Chablis where the lizardmen bandits resided, the weathered tomb of Leviathan that was filled with traps and undead creatures, and the floating city of Carousel where the players fought against the mayflies. Every one of them was an adventure story of wealth and treasures against the shadows of swords. Brando did not expect that he would have the opportunity to visit these places when he was collecting information. But at this moment he stood on top of a hill and looked down at Chablis. Smoke rose from the rooftops like slanted lines before dissipating into the air. Fortunately, I didn't have the intention to take advantage of the situation, or else I would be in a daze right now. He thought about the Basilica of St. Gerlis and the lizardmen bandits. Chablis is as beautiful as described in the forums. It's so peaceful that I want to leave my heart here forever. It's like a calm harbor. The Roman walked out from the forest with her beloved pony. She bought it from a merchant who sent Count Randner to Bragg's, and she was reluctant to ride it. She curiously looked at the mountains and rivers of Chablis, and her dark eyes flashed with excitement. "Brando, is this the place?" she asked. "Yes," Brando replied and nodded. "This is Chablis." The name, Chablis, was left behind by the Silver Elves in the past, and it means sweet mountain range. It seems that we are quite lucky. The undead of Madara did not pass by here, and this place is as peaceful as before. But it's not strange. Insursta's army would definitely choose to march to a more prosperous place. The reason why Sir Black avoided Bragg's was to let Count Randner take advantage of the situation. Of course he wouldn't come to this remote Summer Leaves Hills for no reason. Moreover, these were stories that happened in history and Brando was confident. "Are there any snacks in Chablis?" Romaine immediately asked. "You can try the mountain people's hot pot." Brando turned to look at the girl he loved and smiled dotingly. "But ever since we left Magiton, little Roman has become more and more gluttonous. Be careful not to get fat." When Roman heard this, his pair of small eyebrows immediately stood up. He hurriedly explained, I won't get fat. I'm just eating a little, that's all." But it sounded like she was comforting herself. She secretly used her hand to measure her waist, and her eyebrows furrowed. It was as if she could not decide between eating good food and getting fat. "Sir Knight, do you have this sage's slate you mentioned?" Amandina was riding on a black horse with a glossy coat. Her face had gradually become rosy, and was no longer as pale as the first time she met Brando. Even though the journey was tiring, at least she did not have to worry about her next meal every day. There was a long scroll box tied to her horse's back. Not only was it the crystallization of her wisdom and her most precious treasure, it was also the priceless treasure that Brando valued the most. The reason why he insisted on bringing Amandina along was because of the lines drawn on the parchment. The girl coughed twice, raised her head to look at the clear sky and murmured, "It's almost October. Don't worry, there shouldn't be anyone who will beat us to it this time." Brando knew what Amandina was asking. They had left Bragg's for more than a month, and the news of Erwin and Madara's truce had spread to every nobles in the south by the end of the 8th month. At that time they had just arrived in Randner's territory, and first settled down in the capital of the Count's territory, the city of the forest, Magiton. Brando placed his hopes on the sage slate in the misty forest west of Magiton, but it was obtained by the local Church of the North Wind just like in the game. Brando and Count Randner's Knight of the North Wind did not have much of a relationship, and after staying in the area for a while, he could only leave. But when he was in Magiton, he introduced the Roman to the most famous local snack, a honey dessert. As a result, Amandina was now full of interest in the local snacks. Brando could not help but smile when he thought of this, but he suddenly remembered the matter of the coup in December. There were still 2 months. He knew that he would not be able to make it in time, but he could only leave it to the future regent princess and the girl from Bucci, Freya. Freya should have already arrived at the Royal Knights Academy in the princess' private territory, but he did not know how tense the situation outside was. But there was a limit to a person's strength, and he did not have the capital to participate in the game between the nobles. Brando's biggest task at the moment was to continuously strengthen himself, and when he mentioned strengthening himself, he could not help but think that Reto and the others should have already entered the Erect province. "Are we going to look for the sage slate here?" Amandina asked. "Yes, there is a ruin of the Silver Elves to the north of here, and it is rumored that the sage slate is in there," Brando replied. He wanted to find a guide. He knew the background of this area like the back of his hand, but because he had never been to Chablis before, he did not know the exact location of the Balagon, St. Gerlix. But there was a group of lizard-men bandits in the ruins, and it would not be as easy as he thought. In the game, the Balagon, St. Gerlix was a level 23 dungeon. Even though it was much lower than the forbidden orchard of the golden demonic tree, there was no shortcut to it. He thought for a moment and decided to first enter the town. The 3 of them walked down the mountain and entered Chablis in less than half an hour. In fact, the town of Chablis was different from most of the towns in the south of Erewhon. The mountain dwellers built this town in the middle of the mountain, and it was not a simple matter. They followed the wisdom of their ancestors and piled up stones to fill up the slope, so the new parts of the town were always stacked on top of the old parts. Over time, the entire town was built up along the river at the foot of the mountain, and it looked like a stone fortress. If one had to describe the town with an impression, it would be stairs. A large number of stairs that intersected with each other. The buildings were arranged side by side on the platforms. Narrow and slender stairs connected the platforms that were staggered in space. This place still maintained the primitive appearance of Owen's southern mountains, and the mountain people rarely used magic. They built stone lamp posts on both sides of the stone steps, and placed braziers in the hollowed-out areas to replace oil lamps or magic street lamps. Brando remembered that there was only one bar in Chablis, and it was called Chablis Lantern Grass. This was the name of the Chablis players in the forums, and it was because of this reason that he remembered this legendary inn. It was said to be a legendary inn because it was the home of all the adventurers, mercenaries and players in Chablis. Its appearance was like a large hall, and the guest rooms were at the bottom of the hall. Usually, travelers would gather in the hall above to exchange information. There was only one such inn in the whole of Owen's southern border. Amandina and Romain did not notice anything on the way into the town, but Brendel's sharp senses immediately picked up a trace of unusual aura. On the horse he looked around carefully. The people who were dressed differently from the traditional clothing of the surrounding mountain people were passing through the streets in 2s and 3s. Most of them were in the prime of their lives. Some of these people even cast suspicious glances at the 3 of them. Brando immediately recognized these people. They were travelers, adventurers, mercenaries and monster hunters. These people could appear anywhere in the Wonde, but, for a small place like Chablis, there were too many of them. This was not the same Chablis that had a large number of players in the game. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 134. Yes, these adventurers have been here since a week ago. No, to be more precise, they are mercenaries. Amandina replied calmly. Brando looked at her in surprise. Amandina found a trace of satisfaction in his surprise. "My Lord Knight, are you surprised that a noble's daughter who never leaves her house has the ability to deal with these matters?" She turned around and asked. "I'm just curious about where you learned your skills. You know that this is the reason why Highland Knights are trained. Indeed, a noble's daughter who never leaves her house is able to speak freely in front of others, and it's enough to make people look at you in a different light." Brando patted the Roman's shoulder to prevent her from wandering too far away from the sights. Unexpectedly, the Roman comforted him. "Brando, don't worry, I won't get lost," she said. For a moment, Brando was speechless. He could only look at the Roman with an embarrassed expression, and wondered what kind of structure was in her brain to make her thoughts so different from others. Fortunately, Amandina helped him out of his predicament. "Socializing is an instinct of a noble's daughter, my Lord Knight," she said humbly, but it was not difficult to hear that she was secretly happy. Brendel was taken aback for a moment before he laughed. Not every noble lady can put down her status and interact with a country bumpkin. He was not wrong. In Erewhon, the Highlanders were considered vulgar country bumpkins in the eyes of the nobles. Even the lords of the Highlanders could not get along with the lords of the Northern Empire. For example, the two important ministers of Anson's 11th era, Duke Hernandez and Duke Longblade, often mocked each other in court, causing even Emperor Anson to have a headache. Because I'm different from them. I'm just a poor girl, my lord. Brando laughed and shook his head. These mercenaries must have come to Chablis at this time of the year because of the bandits in the forest. Erewhon often raises money to hire mercenaries to wipe out the bandits entrenched in villages and towns that affect people's daily lives. This has become a common practice. He walked along the paved streets of Chablis and brought the topic back to the main topic. In densely populated areas, the ones who hire these mercenaries are mostly the local police or militia. In remote areas, a village will pool all its money to pay for these mercenaries. Amandina was taken aback. She had never seen such a description in books before. There's such a thing? It was the same in Bucci in the past. The Roman also paid for it. The Roman answered without turning his head, poking his head out of the narrow roadside with great interest, and gazing down at the crisscrossing streets. Only in places where there are guards would the guards be used to dealing with the local bandits themselves. Thus, it is not unreasonable for the royal family to place their hopes in their new army. Indeed, the guards represent a new force in Erewhon, but I don't know if this force will have the chance to grow. Moreover, there will only be one generation of them that can be used. Brando raised his head and said deeply. Amandina lowered her head and began to think about some things again. At this time Brando and the other two heard a shout from behind them, "Stop right there." The three of them were startled and turned around, but they realized that the shout was not directed at them. They first saw a young man rushing through the crowd and hurriedly running past them. However, before he could run a few steps, he was stopped by two mercenaries in front of him. The two mercenaries pulled out their swords and blocked the young man's path. "Eek, where do you think you're going? You bastard, have you forgotten the rules of our mercenary band?" The young man was slightly taken aback and could not help but look around in panic, but he realized that there were mercenaries in leather armor surrounding him with shining swords. In fact, Brendel happened to be at the edge of the encirclement, but no one noticed him and he was happy with it. He pulled Romain back a step to avoid being involved in this inexplicable battle. "Capo, what are you trying to do?" The young man called Eek realized that all of his escape routes were sealed and stopped to catch his breath. He immediately pulled out a short sword from the scabbard and wiped the sweat from his forehead as he asked nervously. "You know what you've done?" A mercenary wearing a gray robe walked out from the crowd and looked at him coldly. "Otherwise, why would you choose to run away today? Have you forgotten the oath you made when you first joined the mercenary band? Our leader and the others treated you like a brother, but why would you betray us?" The young man was stunned for a moment and showed a struggling expression. "Capo, I didn't betray you." The mercenary named Capo looked at him carefully and sighed. "Come back with us and we'll naturally believe you." The young man shook his head. "No, Capo, please don't ask. I've said it before, we can't go to Balagon Forest." He hesitated for a moment and shook his head. "Please trust me this time. Trust me, I won't harm you. Think about the past. How could I betray you, betray everyone?" "Enough, Eek." The mercenary showed a pained expression and interrupted the young man. "No matter what, you have to come back with us and return to our leader's side. If you have anything to say, go back to the camp and our leader will listen to your explanation. Eek, listen to my advice. Our leader raised you and if you leave here, you'll be abandoning him and your comrades." He pointed at himself and the others. "Do you see that? These are your comrades. What are you trying to do?" The young man hesitated for a moment, but took a step back in the end. "Don't say any more, Capo. This time, I'm clear that I'm the one who's right. I won't go back with you. Furthermore, I have to stop you from going to that place. I don't know what to say." He looked around and saw that the other mercenaries were getting closer and closer to him. He couldn't help but beg, "Capo, on account of our relationship, let me go. Believe me, I won't let you regret this, I swear." "Brando?" The Roman saw this scene and couldn't help but ask softly, "My lord?" Amandina also turned her head. Faced with such a situation, the two ladies asked the only person they could rely on at the moment if they wanted to leave for a while. But Brando shook his head and looked at the young man with a thoughtful expression. On the other side, Capo saw the young man's determination and knew that it was useless to say anything more. He took a step back and signaled to his men. The mercenaries immediately rushed forward from all directions and sealed off every path of retreat for the young man called Eek. In fact, Brendel was taken aback when the mercenaries made their move. He immediately realized that these mercenaries were not weak at all. Some of them were even as strong as Leto, which meant that they were at least mid-level iron rank. Even though most of the mercenaries who roamed the outside world had some reputation and strength, Brando was still surprised to see so many powerful mercenaries in a small place like Chablis. Not only Brando but Amandina also noticed this. She wanted to say something, but she calmed down and carefully observed the scene in front of her. Even though she was just a weak noble's daughter, she was still more knowledgeable than Romain and Freya, who came from the countryside. But what shocked Brando even more was the young man. Under the encirclement of 7 or 8 iron-ranked mercenaries, he calmly lowered his center of gravity and rushed forward, grabbing a mercenary's sword with one hand. The youth's movements were so fast that Brendel almost did not see it clearly. He only saw a flick of his hand, and the mercenary was thrown over his shoulder and fell to the ground. Then he leaned to the left and another mercenary was sent flying. His direction was exactly where Brando, Roman, and Amandina were standing. Brando was stunned. Normal people would not be able to withstand the force of this collision. The young man was at least a silver rank. He seemed to be 2 or 3 years younger than Brando, and he could not help but sigh. As expected of the chaotic times, monsters appeared one after another. The first person he saw when he came to this world, little Phyllis, was an outstanding talent. Breton, Irene, Freya, and that Viscount Turst were all outstanding talents. In normal history, there were only a few of these people in a generation. But just from Bucci to Brugloss, these small places, he had already seen a few of them. It had to be said that in the chaotic era after Vaunt, there were indeed some predestined factors in the unseen world. Of course, thinking was just thinking, but his hands were not slow. He used explosive strength to catch the mercenary who was about to crash into him, and then held him up. Brendel almost lost his balance and took a step back. He could not help but exclaim in his heart that the mercenary was too strong. Perhaps the iron-rank mercenary would not be affected by this collision, but if it was a passerby, even if he did not die, he would be seriously injured. But he thought that if he still had the Thorn of Light, he would not have ended up in this situation. But this young man is really reckless, he thought. The mercenary who was knocked dizzy finally caught his breath. He turned around and looked at Brando in surprise. He probably did not expect a random passerby to have the strength of an iron rank. He was stunned for a moment before he realized that he should thank Brendel. "Thank you, sir." Brando shook his head and interrupted him. His gaze was still on the small battlefield. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 135. On the battlefield, another person flew out in a short period of time. The young man seemed to have taken down 3 mercenaries in the blink of an eye and opened up a gap in the crowd. Before anyone could react, he had already broken through the gap. However, the direction he chose surprised Brando because the leader of the mercenaries, Capo, was already waiting in the young man's path. The old mercenary held his sword horizontally and leaned forward with his mouth tightly pursed. He looked like a beast that was about to attack. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He recognized that this posture was from Master Swordsman Emeria's swordsmanship, Lantan Island swordsmanship. This swordsmanship was named after the famous sword saint. It was spread throughout the continent in the early years, but it had already declined during this period. Due to the complexity of the swordsmanship, there were very few people in this world who could master this swordsmanship and use it to fight against their enemies. However, almost all of these people were experts. In the game, Brando remembered that Emeria's swordsmanship required 133 EXP to upgrade from level 1 to level 2, which was 60% more than the average middle-level swordsmanship. Although the accuracy of this swordsmanship was twice that of the military swordsmanship, and the damage correction was 1.3 times, there were not many players who would spend time and effort on this swordsmanship. This was because the market price of this swordsmanship was as high as 1.3 million tor. Only a few countries' museums had rare copies of this swordsmanship. The young man called Eek seemed to have realized his mistake, but retreating at this critical moment was an extravagant hope. He could only grit his teeth and charge forward. Although he did not have a sword in his hand, it was obvious that he had a foundation in swordsmanship. He was using Muax's knight swordsmanship. Brando could tell from the small movements of the young man that he was using. The two of them were from the same mercenary group and seemed to have a good relationship. However, the swordsmanship they used was from different places, which was quite interesting. However, this situation was not very rare, so Brando only paid attention to it subconsciously. At this moment, the young man was charging towards Capo. He was trying to change his path to avoid Capo's swordsmanship. Unfortunately, Capo didn't disappoint Brando. With 2 clean swings of his sword, he sealed off the young man's path, forcing him to jump to the side. At this moment, Capo only needed to take one more step forward to cause the young man to panic. At this moment, Brando's true strength was probably not a match for either of them, but he knew this better than anyone else present. As expected, he saw Capo take a step forward and step right in front of Eek. He held his sword in his hand and prepared to use the hilt of his sword to finish off Eek. However, at this moment, Brando narrowed his eyes slightly. Capo's movements were half a beat slower, and the young man managed to grab onto his arm in the nick of time. Then, the young man's entire body slammed into Capo's chest, causing the old mercenary to stumble back 5 steps. This turn of events was out of everyone's expectations, and even the young man was stunned for a moment. Brando could clearly see a trace of astonishment in his eyes. However, Eek immediately shook his head and glanced at Capo, who was pushed back by him. It was only for a split second, and he immediately fled into the crowd without looking back. What a guy! Brando exclaimed in his heart. This mercenary called Capo was purposely going easy on him. However, his method was really well hidden, and normal people wouldn't be able to see through it. If it wasn't for the fact that he had accumulated a wealth of experience in the game, which was unimaginable for people of his age, he would probably be kept in the dark as well. He had almost 110 years of experience in using swords, and he only had a little more than 10 years of experience in using other weapons. As a veteran warrior who had spent more than 140 years in the game, some of the basic things were as simple as eating and drinking to him. His current strength was only at the upper middle level of a black iron rank, and he might not be a match for the young man called Eek. However, if they were to really fight, even 2 Eeks wouldn't be enough to take him on. Especially after a month of adventuring, Brando's mercenary level had already reached level 16, and Erwin's military swordsmanship had also reached level 9+1. Combined with Brando's memories of his grandfather, his swordsmanship was no longer comparable to that of the young man from Bucci. It could be said that among the regular soldiers of the White Mane Army, those slightly older swordsmanship instructors were only good enough to be his students. Brando's swordsmanship wasn't at the level of his grandfather, but there were traces of similarities. It could be said that he had the demeanor of a swordsmanship master. Of course, a true swordsmanship master wouldn't only be proficient in one skill. But because of this, the more Brando leveled up, the more he felt that his grandfather was mysterious. That old soldier who had over 100 experience couldn't even summon the will to fight when he drew his sword. Was he really just a veteran of the November War? At least, he couldn't see the same thing from Reto, who was also a veteran of the November War. Of course, Reto was a soldier who participated in the later stages of the war, while Brando's grandfather had experienced the entire war from the beginning to the end. This was probably the biggest difference between them. He couldn't help but recall who the candlelight badge of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had been given to, but he couldn't remember who they were. Back then he had more dealings with Erwin's officials, and later joined the Holy Cathedral of Light, so he didn't have much interaction with the Holy Cathedral of Fire. This thought just flashed through his mind. The scene froze for a moment because of the sudden change of events. Most of the people looked at each other, but the sound of voices first came from the surrounding residents. The people began to discuss the gains and losses of the previous battle. Even though most of them didn't even have time to see how the battle started and ended, it didn't stop them from talking. The mercenaries who were knocked down by the young man got up one after another. The people involved didn't say anything, but they looked at each other and didn't seem to be upset or angry. On the contrary, there was a sense of relief. Brando obviously saw their expressions. He turned around and saw Amandina looking at him. The two of them looked at each other and saw a hint of understanding in each other's eyes. Brando, they don't seem to want to chase at all. Roman stood behind Brando and whispered. Brando smiled and nodded. Captain Capo, are you all right? At this moment, he saw a mercenary walking over to the leader of the mercenaries called Capo and carefully questioned him. Capo looked at his wrist and was stunned for a moment. He then raised his head and spoke to the others with a serious expression. I'm fine. All of you spread out and seal off Chablis. Don't let Eek escape. If anything happens this afternoon, I'll take full responsibility. Oh. All right. No problem, Captain Capo. The mercenaries replied numbly, but their reaction was so slow that it made one's hair stand on end. However, the senior mercenary seemed to have ignored them. He looked around and his gaze finally landed on Brando. It was only now that he had the time to take a closer look at Brendel. Brendel had helped his mercenary up earlier, and he had been observing the entire battlefield. In fact, Capo was startled when he saw Brando for the first time. He did not expect Brendel to be so young. From Brendel's previous attack, he had guessed that Brendel was at least a middle-upper iron-ranked fighter. A young man in his 20s with the strength of an iron-ranked fighter. No matter where he went, people would be surprised. Capo immediately thought of Eek. Eek was the most talented youth he had ever seen in his life. He was the adopted son of their leader, maned Wolf, Makarov. He was a genius who had unlocked the second tier of strength at the age of 17. In Capo's impression, only the legendary geniuses who were known as the Enlightened One could have such achievements at such a young age. Eek was the pride and hope of the mercenary group since he was young. Even when he selfishly left the mercenary group, Makarov only ordered them to bring him back. Even so, the others didn't want him to be punished because of his selfishness. It could be seen how much he was pampered by everyone in the mercenary group. Capo calmed down a little when he thought of Eek. Brando's youth had become a lot more natural in his eyes. He let out a sigh and walked over. His expression softened a little as he spoke to Brando and the others. "Thank you for your help. You can call me Capo. Mister, may I ask for your guidance?" "Brando, there's no need to be so polite." Brando was also sizing him up. This experienced mercenary leader had a pair of gray eyes. Brando could see that his brows were constantly furrowed, as if he had an endless amount of worries. His melancholy aura coupled with his gray hair made him look like a handsome uncle. His hands were long and slender from using a sword for a long time. If one didn't look at the calluses on his hands, they would look like the hands of a pianist. If such a man appeared on the streets of the world he came from, he would definitely cause a lot of girls to scream. Brando couldn't help but feel jealous. Even though Brando's body wasn't that bad, his experience was still lacking compared to this man's temperament. He lacked the weather-beaten sense of vicissitudes. It seemed like these mercenaries weren't ordinary people, but he didn't know which famous mercenary group they were from in the south. Brendel looked at the man's attire. He could not find any clues from his attire, and he did not wear any obvious emblems to distinguish him. It seemed like they weren't in the middle of a mission yet. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 136. Brando knew the background of the game like the back of his hand. If Amandina's knowledge of this world was limited to the books, then he was a complete veteran. He stared into Capo's eyes. Even though this leader was obviously going easy on him, Brando was still able to determine his strength from the details of his attacks. He was probably above average silver rank. He's almost at the level of a captain in the White Mane Army. He's probably just a little bit weaker than a commander. This shows that this mercenary group is not to be underestimated. Even though Reto's group is just a bunch of retired mercenaries, all of them are above average iron ranked. Brando guessed that they were not much weaker than these people in front of him when they were at their peak. He had asked Reto and his group of friends about their background once or twice, but Reto did not seem to be willing to talk about it. On the other side, Capo felt a strange feeling in his heart when Brando looked at him. This feeling was almost instinctive. He looked at Brendel's pair of dark eyes that seemed calm and bottomless. In fact, Capo had been to many places as a veteran mercenary and had seen many important people. Some of them were nobles in Erewhon, some were merchants, some were from the north, some were from the south, some were from the mountains, some were from the Tower tribe, and some were from the Desert tribe. He had even seen one or two mysterious wizards. But none of them had a pair of eyes that were as calm as this young man's. He had a smile on his face as if everything was under his control. It was an expression that was filled with confidence and confidence. For a moment, this experienced mercenary had the illusion that all of his secrets were known to the other party. He frowned and shook his head to throw this ridiculous thought out of his mind. But he did not know that this was the truth. He did not expect that Brando would be able to see through him just by looking at a few details. In this era, there were not many people who knew Imeria's swordsmanship. Even Capo himself did not know that his swordsmanship came from Emeria. He was only taught by someone when he was young. Not to mention the fact that his strength had been seen through with just 2 sword strikes. It would be too ridiculous if word got out. Unless the young man in front of him was a swordsmanship grandmaster who was hiding his strength, that would be more like it. His gaze landed on Brando's clothes. They were from Bragg's. Even though the clothes of Grenoirs were similar to those of the southern Erewhon, they were far from the mountains. Capo was about to speak when he noticed this, but Brando's words were cut in front of him. "You're not from this place, right? Mercenaries?" Brando's gaze passed Capo's eyes. When Brando spoke, Amandina and Amandina's left and right respectively. Amandina was from a noble family and was well educated. She naturally knew that this was not the time for her to speak. However, the future merchant girl seemed to be born with such knowledge. She obediently blinked her eyes and looked at Brando and Capo without saying a word. Capo was slightly surprised. Yes, you are. We pass by Chablis a few times every year. Even though we're not locals, we're at least familiar with this place. In fact, when I entered the town, I was wondering why there were so many travelers in Chablis. Brando's face did not change as he spoke the non-existent truth. Until I saw you guys, I just remembered that you're mercenaries. Amandina's eyes flashed behind his back, but her expression did not change. Amandina's little Roman listened with a smile, as if Brando was speaking the truth. It had to be said that Amandina was born with the ability to deceive people. We're here to exterminate the lizard men bandits in the forest. Brando's answer was reasonable, and the key point was that he was calm and composed. No one could see any flaws in his words. The experienced mercenaries naturally did not have any doubts and replied in such a manner. Moreover, their reason for coming here was not a secret. However, Capo was still vigilant and didn't continue the conversation. Instead, he asked, "How many times do you pass by Chablis in a year? Sir, you're a merchant, right? If you have any use for our mercenary group, please feel free to call us. We will definitely provide the best service." As he spoke, he turned around to look, "But I'm sorry, we have a small problem here. I'm afraid I'll have to leave immediately. If you have time, I represent my leader to welcome you to our mercenary group as a guest." Brando smiled. This guy was obviously trying to stall for time. He probably wanted to find the young man from before. However, he pretended that he did not see it and put on a sudden realization expression. "I see. That's a coincidence," he added quickly. Capo was about to leave when he heard this sentence. "What's wrong?" "It's like this." Brando smiled and went along with Capo's words. "Actually, I didn't come to Chablis for business. I came to look for something." Capo was stunned for a moment before he stopped with a frown. "What are you looking for?" "It's just a stone tablet with ancient records. It's in the Balagon ruins and it's in the Silver Elf stone tablets. But as you know, Mr. Capo, the ruins were occupied by a group of lizard men a year and a half ago. The last time I came to Chablis was 3 months ago to investigate the lizard men bandits in the forest. This time, I brought a few mercenaries with me and wanted to sneak in to steal the stone slab, but I didn't expect to meet Mr. Capo and the rest of you here." Brendel replied calmly as though there was really something going on. "That's 3 months ago. I came to Chablis to investigate the lizard men bandits in the forest." Capo was completely stunned. "You're saying?" Brando immediately nodded. "Yes, according to the rules, in order to avoid conflict, I suggest that we use the 314th rule of the Mercenary Code to come to an agreement. How about that? My men and I will temporarily join you and fight alongside you as long as we don't endanger ourselves. After the mission is over, we'll go our separate ways and take what we need. How about that?" The rules of the mercenary world were mostly not written down, but it was enough to settle most disputes. However, the rules between mercenaries and their employers were usually strictly enforced, but disputes between mercenaries would often lead to different opinions. About a century ago, the Adventurers Guild, which was a subordinate organization of the Holy Cathedral of Fire that managed adventurers and mercenaries, had compiled these rules into a code that was commonly used by mercenaries. This code was called the Mercenary Code, and it was a temporary solution to these disputes in the future. This code had been modified, added, and deleted over the past 100 years, and it was now quite complete. However, there were still some unfamiliar terms in it. For example, the one Brando mentioned was a rule that was popular in the northern highlands of Erewhon about 150 years ago, but it was rarely mentioned in this era. That was why Capo couldn't help but be stunned when he heard this suggestion. "There's no problem with this code." Capo looked at Brando suspiciously. "But I don't have the right to decide. If you're interested, you should go and meet our leader. His name is Makarov, also known as the Maned Wolf. He's in the inn right now, you should be able to find him there." "No problem." Brando nodded. "Then I'll take my leave first. I won't delay Mr. Capo's business any longer." Capo had already regained his senses and only nodded in response. Brando didn't mind Capo's reaction at all. He already had this thought when he saw these people. Even though the lizard men in the Balagon forest weren't ferocious existences, it would still be troublesome for him to deal with them alone. However, if he could borrow the strength of these mercenaries, things would be much easier. The sage slate was nothing more than a slate in the eyes of those who didn't know what it was. In fact, in the past, the value of these stone slabs only increased after cross-region missions became more frequent. That was why Brando believed that he had the ability to convince Capo. But who was the leader that Capo mentioned again? Maned Wolf Makarov? Brando paused for a moment before he realized that he had almost forgotten about this important piece of information. So it was the Blue Mountain Mercenary Group. This was one of the 22 most famous mercenary groups in the southern border. But didn't the Blue Mountain Mercenary Group only become famous in the year of spring? That would be 5 years later. He rubbed his forehead and felt a little puzzled. Did he remember it wrongly, or did history change in some way? However, what Brando didn't know was that Capo was also puzzled. "Captain, who is that?" Capo looked at his subordinate and shook his head. "I'm not sure, but he seems to be a local merchant. He seems to be very familiar with our rules. There are 314 rules, but I've never heard of this rule before. It can't be fake, right?" one of the mercenaries asked. Capo shook his head. Of course he knew that it wasn't fake. However, he only remembered this rule after Brando mentioned it. This wasn't a big deal as there were more than 700 rules in the mercenary group and it was impossible for one to remember every single detail. In fact, other than the core 13 rules, most of the rules were just supplementary explanations and weren't as strict in real life. However, the more Capo thought about it, the more mysterious Brando was. He felt that this young man wasn't as simple as he seemed. "It's always good to have more people." Someone immediately said. "That's not necessarily true. Who knows if they're spies from the other side?" "That's true. Don't worry, even if it's temporary, he has to pass the leader's test." A mercenary replied, "The leader will definitely send Gabu. Sai, it's a pity that Eek has this problem. Otherwise he would be in the limelight again." Speaking of Eek, the mercenaries couldn't help but fall silent. P.S. I originally wanted to write 3 chapters, but I realized that I'm still a little rusty. But no matter what, I'm finally able to catch my breath. I wrote intermittently during the Chinese New Year and couldn't find the feeling for it. I've only slowly recovered these 2 days. I should prepare to recover and speed up. Sorry for the long wait. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 137. Chablis Lantern Grass Inn was located at the highest point of the town on the east side of the cliff. It looked like the ancient legends where the heroes and gods lived. The wooden hall was built on top of the cliff, and after being exposed to the wind and rain, water had seeped into the sturdy wood and turned it black. Looking down from the hall, there were rows of windows on the gray-white cliff. From afar, this unique scene looked like a huge beehive or a dragon's den on the cliff. But in reality, that was the inn's guest room. The door to the room Makarov the maned wolf was staying in was pushed open 15 minutes ago. The experienced mercenary leader raised his head from the map of Chablis. His thick eyebrows twitched when he heard a certain term from his subordinate. His deerskin-gloved hand was still holding onto the magnifying glass with a bronze handle, but he had already opened his mouth and asked, "Article 314 of the Constitution? During an official mission, if there is a conflict between the 2 parties, the 2 parties shall be merged. Both parties shall be considered as having reached an agreement. The details of the merger shall be discussed by both parties." An old man with white hair and beard sitting on a rattan chair by the window answered. The old man stared at the red book in his hand that was about 4 inches thick and didn't seem to be interested in the topic. "Grandmaster Fleetwood, can this rule be extended?" "Not necessarily," the old man replied. "All right, then let me see who that young man is." Makarov waved his hand at the young man in front of his table and said, "Go, let Rady test him." But he immediately stopped the young man. "Wait, did you find Eek?" "Not yet, my lord." "All right, I got it. You may go." Makarov shook his head and grunted, "This time I must teach him a lesson. It seems like I've spoiled him too much. If this continues, I won't be able to explain myself to the Lord." A smile flashed across the old man's face as he read, and he shook his head slightly. "You're Brando?" "I'm Brando." Brando raised his head and looked at the young man who was almost a head taller than him. His hair was a rare pure white, and his eyes were golden like amber. His face was feminine and he looked like a woman. "A Yablis?" Brando thought. The only impression he had of this minority was the silver-haired sword St. Gory Keys who was active in Wone 30 years ago. He knew that Makarov wouldn't accept his request so easily, but he didn't expect him to send such a young man to test him. To be honest, Other than the Enlightened One and the Chosen One, there were very few youths around his age in this era who could defeat him. Level 23 Strength of the Iron Tier. Moreover, level 15 was the first threshold for any profession. Once this threshold was crossed, the profession's attribute bonus would enter the stage of level 1 strength to level 2 strength. In fact, even though Brando had lost the Thorn of Light, his strength had increased to level 15, which was 12 or even 13 times that of a trained soldier. Even though he looked like a frail young man, he could easily kill a wild boar with a single punch if he wanted to. As long as Brendel opened his status panel, he could clearly see that his absolute strength had reached a terrifying value of 220. In other words, theoretically speaking, if he were to face any second or third tier army of any country in this world, he would be able to easily slaughter his way in and out of the place. Aween's adventurers usually referred to him as the strength of a squadron leader. Moreover, Brando's hidden strength was far more than that. Just his level 10 Erewhon military swordsmanship was enough to make most of Erewhon's officers and knights blush with shame. Of course, Brando didn't feel that way. He only felt that there was still some distance between him and his grandfather. But before he could finish his thoughts, the young man had already pulled out his sword and pointed it at him. The tip of the sword swayed slightly, and a cold light flashed in his vision. Listen well, merchant. I will never accept a weak challenge, nor will I show mercy. It's the exact opposite. Because the duel between warriors is sacred. It's a battle of swords and swords trying to end the opponent's life. The white-haired young man said, "The commander allowed me to fight you, but I won't go against my will and show mercy. Have you thought it through?" Brando turned to look at the Roman. "Brando, does he mean that he's stronger than you?" Romaine's eyes widened. In fact, she was trying to widen them even more. She blinked and asked, "No, I don't think that's what he meant." Brando was not angered to death by the Roman, and could only reply in an annoyed manner. "My lord?" Amandina asked. Brando shook his head. "Can't you have a little bit of confidence?" But he had already pulled out the sword at his waist. After losing the Thorn of Light, he had been using a normal steel longsword just like the one in his hand. The white-haired young man looked at his sword and couldn't help but show a trace of contempt. The sword was brand new, as if it was just bought from a blacksmith's workshop. He was not wrong, and the truth was as such, because the previous sword had been shattered in a battle because it could not withstand Brendel's power. Brando raised the sword and waved it casually, as if he was getting used to this new sword. But his actions immediately caused the mercenaries and explorers in the inn to hiss. No swordsman would only get used to their sword before a battle. Brando's performance was like a young boy who had never been on the battlefield before. "Rady, isn't your idol the Jacobite sword St. Gory Keys? Defeat this young boy and show us your strength." "Well said, as a fellow sword saint, you can't embarrass yourself. Rady, do your best, kill him." The mercenaries immediately became rowdy. These lawless people were a group of people who would never know their place no matter where they were. But when Brando heard one of the names, he couldn't help but be slightly startled. Gory Keys. He was about to enter the preparation position of Erewhon's military swordsmanship, but he relaxed his mind and raised his head to ask. This distraction caused him to only complete half of his movement, and the military swordsmanship's starting position went out of shape. The mercenaries booed again. "You don't deserve to mention that name." The white-haired young man's face darkened as he thrust his sword forward. The sword was as fast as lightning in the eyes of ordinary people, but in Brando's perception range of 3.7 ounces it was extremely slow. Moreover, he was attacked before he could finish his sentence. He subconsciously backhanded his sword, or more accurately, he raised his sword and slashed the sword out of the young man's hand. Whoosh! The white-haired young man couldn't hold his sword at all, and it flew out of his hand and stabbed into the ceiling. The young man's sword was deeply embedded into the light black wood, and it was still trembling slightly. The entire hall was stunned. The mercenaries who had been cheering loudly earlier were now dumbfounded. It was as if they had seen a dragon or something else. They opened their mouths in a daze. To be exact, they had forgotten whether they should be cheering or booing. Brando's sword was not elegant at all. To put it bluntly, it was like a barbarian swinging a stick. Because it was not a type of swordsmanship, it was purely an instinctive reaction. But the key to this sword was not its elegance, but its strength. Innate strength? Everyone subconsciously thought of this. This was nothing new. On the road of Vaunt, legend had it that some of the humans inherited the bloodline of the Golden Bloodline, and some were naturally awakened as the Chosen One. But there was another type, they left behind some of the characteristics of their ancestors. For example, they were born with innate strength or strong recovery ability, or they were born with the ability to see elemental power. Generally speaking, this kind of power could only be seen in creatures with golden bloodline, such as dragons, unicorns, and other mythical creatures. But immediately someone shouted, "Level 1 strength. Iron strength." The white-haired young man held his wrist and took 5 steps back. He looked at his swollen arm and for a moment he couldn't accept it. Although he was not as talented as Eek, he was able to reach the lower levels of the iron rank in his early 20s. He was considered one of the best among most people. However, he did not expect that he would not be able to withstand even one strike from a person younger than him. How could there be so many monsters like Eek in this world? Rady was stunned for a moment. But his shock only lasted for a moment, because Makarov and another tall middle-aged man came up from below the inn. Although they didn't see the previous scene, they only needed to look at the swords on the ceiling and the reactions of the people on the scene. This shrewd mercenary group leader understood 80% of the situation. His gaze fell on Brando's head and he frowned. Even though he knew that the merchant who wanted to join his group was a young man, he didn't expect him to be so young. "Buga," Makarov lowered his voice and said to the middle-aged man beside him, "You go test him." Meh. The middle-aged man's voice had a thick Iraq accent. "Yes, I suspect this young man is from Paper Cards." Makarov stared at Brando and said, "Do they have such an outstanding young man?" "Makarov, aren't you thinking too much?" Buga said as he unsheathed the great sword on his back. "But it's fine. Since you said so, I'll give it a try. No matter what, this young man must have some background." Makarov was startled as he turned around to look at his old friend. "It's nothing, I just smelled something familiar." The middle-aged man looked at Brando with a hint of doubt in his eyes. "P.S. I'm really still writing. Some of my friends' words are warm and some of them are depressing. Continue writing, I want to rebuild my character. I hope everyone can forgive me for the erratic updates. I'm writing as much as I can and I'm not slacking off. As for the problem of saving manuscripts, I really don't have the habit of saving manuscripts. Sorry, I only saved a short amount of manuscripts when I uploaded the book, and they were all sent out quickly." Chapter 138. The silence in the hall lasted for a long time. Brendel looked at the white-haired youth who was clutching his wrist in disbelief, then looked at the sword that was still vibrating on the ceiling. He let out a sigh of relief. He was not surprised by this result. After the previous attack, Brando felt that this youth called Rady's strength was about 4 to 5 times that of a normal person, which meant that he had just stepped into the iron rank. It was the same level as when he was in the Golden Demonic Tree Canyon. This kind of strength was considered outstanding for his age, but it naturally could not be compared to his cheat code. Brando thought about his own strength. In this period of history he had indeed used a cheat code. In a week he had unlocked the first level of strength. In a month he had entered the iron rank and in the 3rd month he had entered the silver rank. Even though it was not comparable to the Chosen, it was still unprecedented. As for whether there would be others after that, Brando could not say. According to the game's calculation, the silver rank would start from level 35. Brando estimated that he would need to reach level 40, which was about 600,000 experience points. And he had to store enough experience points in 7 months. Only then would he not miss the last train to Erwin's December Civil War. While he was thinking, he saw the crowd split into 2 sides. Amandina made a small sound of surprise. Brando was also slightly surprised, and then his gaze fell on 2 people at the back of the crowd. The one in front was a man wearing chainmail and a blood-red cloak. He wore a tall hat with colorful feathers on it. He looked like an explorer from Erwin's Royal Geographical Society, but the brooch on his chest was not the Royal Geographical Society's blazing amber, but a simple wooden medallion. The medallion was engraved with a kingfisher. The taller man in the back was wearing simple leather armor. The armor only protected the important parts of his body, so the muscles on his arms were exposed. He was carrying a huge sword that was at least 5 feet long on his shoulder. His forehead was wide, but his cheeks were deeply sunken as if they had been cut by a knife. He pursed his thin lips, giving people the impression that he was not angry but he was imposing at first glance. When Brando saw this person he could not help but be stunned. Isn't this that guy? Brando could not help but have a little doubt in his mind. Because of this tall man who looked like a barbarian from the snowy highlands, the moment he saw him, he immediately sketched out an image in his mind. A Rex Crosshand Buga, the trusted aide of Duke Lone, the captain of the guards of Lantern Island Castle. Arek was one of the 3 most famous swordsmen. He was one of the great swordsmen on par with Devard the Eagle and Sylvia the Silver Knight. Brando knew this guy because he was a famous character in the game in the past. As the guard captain of Lantern Island Castle, Wuxia the Cross Hand was the initiator of Lun's main mission Courage. Brando was one of the few players who had personally experienced the series of missions. In fact, he still had a vivid memory of that shocking battle. He remembered, that should be the last part of the mission. In the mission, the players had to help Wuxia kill one of the 12 tree herders' patriarchs, the envoy of sorrow, Furnica. Furnica was level 97 and had mastered the highest level of the superior element, darkness. He had almost perfected his bronze body. In fact, in the era when the player's level cap was only level 83, the 12 tree herders' patriarchs were basically undefeatable nightmares. At that time the story went like this. Wuxia carried the great sword, the legendary Arwen, on his back and led the players into the headquarters of the tree herders in the Lone Kingdom, the Forbidden Forest. Using the knight swordsmanship of the Scene School, he was also the only legendary existence who had mastered level 17 swordsmanship. The player's level cap was 13. He only needed 4 strikes to kill the envoy of sorrow, Furnica. Throughout the entire mission the players were like spectators. They only needed to help Wuxia block the monsters and stall for time. In fact, it was this battle that cemented Brando's decision to walk the path of a warrior to the end. He was only level 72 at that time, but later on he became one of the few pure warriors in Wond who had a silver body. Thinking back to that time and looking at Wuxia who was still in his prime, Brando was a little dazed. He didn't expect to meet him here. This was the future greatsword hero Wuxia. Of course, Brando didn't dare to confirm that Wuxia didn't have the same terrifying strength as he did in the future. But from what he remembered, Wuxia the Crosshand was already a student of the knight swordsmanship of the Scene School at the age of 17. Not long after that he got to know the Duke of Lone. But why would he appear in such a remote place? Why is he here? Brando had just thought of this when he felt Wuxia's gaze on him. You're using military swordsmanship? Wuxia's blue-gray eyes flashed with a faint light. His eyebrows were sparse and his eyes were dull and lifeless. But from his appearance, this future greatsword hero didn't look like a monster at all. But the aura he exuded told him one thing. This ordinary-looking man was definitely a terrifying beast. The more sensitive one's senses were, the more they could feel this. Brando stood there, his 3.7 ounces of perceptive sense was equivalent to a normal person being able to hear whispers behind a wall. He could also easily feel the flow of air. But at this moment, Wuxia gave him the feeling that he was a towering mountain, standing still and unmoving. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. He clearly saw that the other party was standing there alone, but he felt as if he was facing an impenetrable wall. Brando gulped, slightly surprised. In the game, one would need to be at least level 30 to have such an aura. If that's the case, doesn't that mean Wuxia has already awakened his elemental power? So young? He was shocked. Brando knew that Wuxia wasn't a chosen one, but this achievement was enough to make some chosen ones blush with shame. As expected of a monster. Are you from the army, or are you a young man from a garrison somewhere? There shouldn't be anyone with your strength in the militia. Wuxia raised his eyebrows slightly and asked. Brando's reaction wasn't out of his expectations. So far, Eek was probably the only one in the entire mercenary group who could remain unmoved under his aura. That young man could indeed be said to be a prodigy. Wuxia couldn't help but smile when he thought of Eek. But the smile disappeared as soon as it appeared, because Wuxia was still staring at Brando. In the whole of Erewhon, there were only 3 types of people who practiced military swordsmanship. Soldiers, militia, or garrison. Knight nobles mostly had their own family swordsmanship, while adventurers and mercenaries from all over the world, even if they were from the military, would add their own swordsmanship after being honed in battle. And this young man in front of him was obviously a student from the training camp. Wuxia's identity was special, so he knew all these things very well. But he didn't expect Brando to shake his head. No, actually my ancestor was a Highland knight. But I'm here alone without my squire. As you can see, I want to join you temporarily because it's beneficial for both of us. I don't have any other motives, and if I have any other ideas, that's all. He thought for a while and decided not to directly point out Wuxia's identity to avoid arousing suspicion. The man standing beside Wuxia, wearing an explorer's hat, heard this answer and showed a kind smile. We're more than happy to accept your suggestion, but you should understand that a mercenary group doesn't need burdens. Brando glanced at Wuxia and understood 80% of the situation. I understand, so please tell me who I want to spar with. I think I've already defeated someone, and according to the rules, there shouldn't be more than 3 such tests. As a player who spent most of his time traveling, Brando was as familiar with the rules as any scholar who studied them. Makarov and Buga looked at each other. Then the tall man took out his greatsword and said, "Then let me test you, young man." As expected, Brando couldn't help but take a deep breath. He looked at Buga's thin face, but he didn't feel nervous. Instead, he felt excited. "Alright, I wonder how strong Buga is now. But it's not a bad idea to test my strength against this future great swordsman." Brando couldn't help but feel excited. He raised his greatsword and felt every cell in his body burning. When he became a level 130 warrior, Buga had already passed away. In fact, one of Brando's biggest regrets was that he didn't have the chance to spar with the great swordsman in his heart before he matured. Buga was once his goal, and even though he awakened his silver body, he still missed the chance to spar with this great swordsman. However, he didn't expect that when time returned to this moment, he would accidentally win another chance like this. Although he couldn't be considered a swordsman with outstanding swordsmanship, Brando knew that his understanding of swordsmanship wasn't inferior to anyone else. It was as if he had returned to the level 130 veteran warrior that he once was. He looked up, and his eyes were so bright that they seemed to be burning. The young man raised his greatsword. The level 10 military swordsmanship was no longer as simple as a high-level basic swordsmanship, and the natural aura it exuded was enough to capture everyone's attention. Brendel had seen such an aura from his grandfather before, but it did not cause people to feel as if they were about to fall into the abyss and fall into the abyss. But it was enough to stun the mercenaries. Great military swordsmanship. Buga's eyes glowed. "You're qualified to spar with me. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.gdn.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading." Chapter 139. You do have what it takes to fight me. Just as the word fight came out of his mouth, Wuxia's greatsword swung over his head like a silver chain. There was a distance of about 10 meters between him and Brando, but in a split second, the heavy blade had already reached Brando's head. Brando did not need to look up to know how dangerous the attack was. It was as if 1,000 miles of mountains were collapsing on top of his head, and thunder was rolling down from the sky. Before the sword even reached him, the momentum was already overwhelming. This sword was at least at the peak of gold rank, but it was different from Ter's sword. Buga's sword was thick and heavy, and the moment he struck out, it made people feel small and insignificant, as if they couldn't dodge it at all. Brendel had experienced such a sword before. Even though he did not experience it personally, but the mountain collapsing, tsunami-like momentum was the same as this time. He closed his eyes and raised the sword above his head. His forehead, shoulder, and left arm formed a solid line of defense. This was Erwin's most profound parrying technique. Erwin's military swordsmanship level 9. Brando hoped that this parrying technique, which had a 27% deflection rate in the game, would have the desired effect. He needed to be calm when facing Buga's greatsword. The greatsword swung down and the two swords clashed. Dazzling sparks flew as the two swords collided. Brando's longsword bent backwards as much as possible. But it was not at its limit yet. The young man continued to adjust his strength, but Buga's greatsword was like a giant boulder. The unparalleled strength of the greatsword penetrated into his arms inch by inch. He quickly realized that he could not retreat and he could not dodge. There was no way out. Brando's thoughts flashed like lightning, and his understanding of the warrior class flashed through his mind. Or rather, it was more like an instinctive reaction. He leaned back and slid to the side. Buga's greatsword missed its target and hit the ground with a loud crack. The 5 wooden planks crumbled at the same time, and the wood splinters scattered like butterflies. Brando suddenly realized that Buga was not using his full strength. This future Grandmaster Swordsman had exposed his trump card the moment he drew his sword. Buga had already awakened his elemental element. His elemental element was earth, which was of a relatively high level. Otherwise, he would not have been able to comprehend such a vast and boundless sword will. Brando thought as he panted. The hall was completely silent. Although everything that had happened just now was like a fleeting shadow, and almost no one had seen clearly what had happened in the previous exchange. However, when they saw that Brando didn't seem to have suffered much of a loss, they couldn't help but hold back their exclamations. For a moment they didn't know what to say. Buga's 70% attack was dodged by a swordsman who was only an upper iron level swordsman. What was going on? Those mercenaries who thought they were as strong as Brando couldn't help but put themselves in his shoes and think about what they could do under that level of attack. It was as if he could only close his eyes and wait for death. That attack just now, it seems like the vice commander used at least 70% of his strength. It's luck, right? Such exquisite swordsmanship. How is that possible? Whispers spread among the crowd, and the spectators all had different expressions as they looked at each other. However, the two combatants ignored them. Buga raised his head and did not rush to pull his greatsword out of the ground. Instead, he looked at Brando in surprise. At first, he thought that Brando was just a young man with some talent, but he was used to seeing Eek's prodigy and didn't think much of the others. But now, Buga realized that the young man in front of him was not simple at all. That slip just now was obviously a profound technique. Buga's guess was not wrong. Brando's technique came from the long-lost swordsmanship of the fallen elves, the movement technique of the shadow sword. This swordsmanship focused on dexterity and agility, and its purpose was to attack the enemy without defense. That was why Brando used it to deal with Buga. Unfortunately, Brando did not dare to hope for that swordsmanship. According to his experience in the game, Won should be in the first chapter of the game, The Empire of Birth, which talked about the rise of Madara. Unearthing the ancient texts would have to wait until the third chapter, Ancient Legacies, and those ancient swordsmanship would only appear in the light of day at that time. Seeing that Buga stopped attacking, Brando sighed in relief. He swung his arm, but he did not feel any soreness or numbness. This meant that Buga had maintained his strength at the same level as him. His heart suddenly skipped a beat. Since Buga only treated this battle as a test, then he might have a chance to turn the tables. Brando was eager to give it a try. If Buga maintained his strength at the same level as him and tried to defeat him with only his understanding of swordsmanship, then he would be digging his own grave. Who was he? Even though level 130 wasn't the strongest player in the Amber Sword, it wasn't something that the current Buga could compare to. Brando's character in the game had used 17 different swordsmanship in the past 100 years, and more than half of them had reached level 10. As for the swordsmanship that he had seen and fought against, there were countless of them. Buga's swordsmanship came from Sean's Night School of Swordsmanship, which was how he got his nickname, Crosshand. Coupled with his own understanding of the earth, swordsmanship, that kind of majestic strength combined with the momentum of 1,000 caddies, it was enough to capture the opponent's attention before the sword was even drawn. Unfortunately, this set of swordsmanship had no effect on Brando. He even knew that he would not fall into his opponent's rhythm, so before Buga could draw his sword, he had already taken the initiative to attack. The move was simple, Erwin's military style of swordsmanship. However, this stab gave everyone a fright. Especially those who had already learned Erwin's military style of swordsmanship. Swordsmanship was just a beginner's technique, Erwin's military style of swordsmanship level 0. Many people had learned it and practiced it repeatedly, but they could not imagine how a sword could cross a distance of 5 meters in an instant. Brando saw a flash of surprise in Buga's eyes, and he could not help but laugh in his heart. It seemed that although this future Grandmaster swordsmanship was an intermediate level swordsmanship, the level of his swordsmanship had not reached a certain level. After all, at this point in time, Buga was at most 50 or 60 years old, which was the period of his growth. It was normal that his swordsmanship had not reached the level of a master yet. But if that was the case, then he would not understand how terrifying a master's swordsmanship could be once it surpassed level 10. Erwin's military style of swordsmanship had a range of 1.5 meters, and with the master's bonus, it could reach 3.5 meters. However, Brando knew a few tricks, and 5 meters was the result of him deliberately hiding his strength. Otherwise, it would not be impossible for his sword to cross 7 meters. Of course, when his swordsmanship reached level 20, the bonus of a Grandmaster's swordsmanship would be monstrous. Above Grandmaster there was the legendary threshold of level 30, but Brando had only heard of it and had never seen it with his own eyes. In any case, his sword was as fast as a shooting star. It was so fast that the surrounding mercenaries forgot to boo. At this time, Buga did not have time to withdraw his weapon. After a slight pause, he noticed Brando's intention and could not help but laugh. In his opinion, a swordsman should not rely on such petty tricks to fight against enemies. But since Brando insisted, he subconsciously prepared to teach this young man a lesson. Unfortunately, Buga immediately realized that it was not the case. Brando's sword seemed to have come alive. It was obviously a simple thrust, but after withdrawing his sword, he should have taken another step and used the hilt to strike his opponent. Then he would turn around and strike again. Brando thought so too, but at the last moment, Buga saw him change direction 3 times and directly thrust his sword towards his chest. Buga was slightly startled. He had no choice but to withdraw his sword and move sideways. But Brando seemed to know what he was going to do. His sword was already waiting in front of him. This future Grandmaster Swordsman was shocked and could only retreat again. But once he retreated, it was not over because Brendel followed up with another 3 swords and a sudden thrust. After another thrust, Buga could no longer hold back. He was very familiar with Erwin's military swordsmanship, but he had never seen anyone use Erwin's military swordsmanship like this before. But Brando was able to use it methodically and with such brilliance. Buga swore that in this country, there was not a single infantry manual that described the techniques of this swordsmanship. But now this young man was telling him that it was possible. This was a technique that countless warriors had come up with. Its techniques had long surpassed Erwin's military swordsmanship, and most of the NPC instructors had recommended the basic attack routes and routines. In the past 30 to 40 years, players had begun to summarize the essence of battle tactics, and they finally realized that they did not need to blindly follow the system's instructions. The innovation of techniques had begun. And now, Buga was facing the new Erwin's military swordsmanship that the players had laid the foundation for 30 years later. And in this, there was Brando's own experience as a Grandmaster Swordsman. That was why when Buga entered Brando's rhythm, he immediately felt the pressure. The young man in front of him seemed to know his every move, and he himself was at a loss. It felt like a novice swordsman facing off against a master swordsman. Buga suddenly recalled what happened when he first started learning swordsmanship. It was not a difference in strength. It was a difference in technique. This future Grandmaster Swordsman was forced back 7 or 8 steps by Brando, and he could not even touch the edge of his own sword. He could not take it anymore, and if this continued there would be no result. In the end he had no choice but to use his full strength. He directly used his elemental power to block Brando's attack. Dang! A loud sound rang out. This time, Brando was finally unable to defend himself, and he was sent flying back 10 meters into the crowd. The hall was silent. No one even remembered to cheer for this attack. The mercenaries only had a dull thought in their minds. What kind of swordsmanship was that? Was this what Erwin's military swordsmanship looked like? How high was this young man's talent in swordsmanship? Buga was almost unable to block a round of attacks? Could it be that I'm still asleep? No, this must be a dream. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 140. I didn't expect my lord's swordsmanship to be so high. Amandina praised without reservation as they walked. The only time she had the chance to witness Brando's full strength was at Bragg's underground auction, but she was busy running away with Roman and did not have the time to see how Brando dealt with the terracotta captain. The footsteps of the 3 people passed through the empty corridor inside the stone wall of the inn. A series of hollow sounds extended forward until the dark end of the corridor. The owner of the inn had carved stone windows into the rock wall to provide light. Looking forward, the natural light cast pale, faint spots of light on the dark floor at regular intervals. Yeah, Brando has always been very strong. Roman added with a little self-satisfaction. She narrowed her eyes with a hint of natural charm. She turned around and glanced at Brando with a smile. Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he was worried that she was planning something strange again. This worry was not groundless. Before leaving the forest city, Roman did not know her place at all. First, she pretended to be a merchant to visit the local nobles and investigate the market. Then, she secretly bought a map from the Brotherhood of Thieves from Magetan to Chablis. This could be said to be extremely daring, since privately drawing a map in this era was a risk of being hanged. Of course, this matter was carried out without Brendel's knowledge. If it wasn't for the fact that she could never hide anything from him, he probably wouldn't have known that she was secretly doing these little things by herself. Hiding a map, pretending to be a noble, and forging documents and documents. Brando thought that he had already disregarded the laws of this ancient kingdom, but he did not expect that Romain did not even care about the black cover of the kingdom's laws. Of course, Brando suspected that she did not even know about the existence of the law. But Roman was careful and cautious outside, and she was as smart as a little fox. She did not reveal anything at all. If Brando did not find her secretly counting money in the carriage, he would not have known that she had used these illegal methods to earn a small sum of pocket money. Of course, Brando had already warned her about this matter, but she accepted it humbly and agreed with a few words. Perhaps only Martha would know how much she listened. "What are you thinking about now?" Brando could not help but ask. "No." Roman hurriedly shook his head as if something was wrong. "Then why are you so nervous?" Brando's suspicions deepened, and he asked in a bad mood. "Are you nervous, Brando?" Roman touched her small face and asked curiously with her eyes wide open. "Don't try to change the topic. This trick of yours is useless against me, little Roman." "Don't call me that." Romane's eyebrows raised, but her eyes immediately. "Brando, can I go out by myself?" "Of course not." Brando flatly refused. He was not afraid that this beautiful little town of Chablis would be ruined by her, but he had other considerations. Today he fought against Buga in front of everyone and used his master-level swordsmanship to intimidate everyone. Even the maned wolf, Makarov, could not say anything about it. But that was only on the surface. After the hot-bloodedness of a warrior faded away, he felt that his thoughts had become clear again. In the past, it was normal for a single mercenary or adventurer to join an unfamiliar mercenary group during a trip. In fact, anyone could run into trouble during a trip and have to rely on others for help. Although the 314th clause of the mercenary contract rarely appeared in official contracts, it was not uncommon for a single person to join an unfamiliar group. Even though they were in a group on the surface, they were still working for their own interests. That was why, other than helping each other, there was not much meaning to it. Therefore, the written rules that stated that mercenary groups could propose tests for their members were actually just empty words in many cases. That was why Makarov the maned wolf and Buga's actions in the afternoon seemed to have a hidden meaning. Brando could even see the suspicion in the eyes of the middle-aged man standing beside Buga. But was there a need for that? He was a little doubtful. Then he couldn't help but think of the scene outside in the afternoon. From the words and actions of the young man named Eek, it seemed that the mercenary group's operation to suppress the bandits this time wasn't as simple as he had imagined. Do they have other motives? Or did they run into some trouble? That's what I want to know. He did not want these mercenaries to be after the same thing as him. That would be troublesome. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but frown deeply. "What's wrong, Brando?" The Roman blinked. "Are you mad at me?" "Of course not." Brando glared at her. He knew that she was not afraid of him being angry. She was just trying to find a topic to talk about. "Amandina, what did they say they were from?" Brendel turned around and asked. He suddenly remembered something. This was a new question for him. "The Grey Wolves mercenaries." "Grey Wolves? Why, is there a problem?" Amandina asked. "Nothing." Brando answered casually and then muttered to himself. "Grey Wolves mercenaries, Grey Wolves? Shouldn't it be the Blue Mountain mercenaries? That should be Makarov the maned wolf." That's right, the middle-aged man was exactly the same as the description. There should be no mistake. But why was the name of the mercenary group different? Could it be that there was a change in history? He raised an eyebrow. There was another possibility that the mercenary group had changed its name. But in this field, changing a name was not a small matter. Not to mention the fact that it had to be registered with the Adventurers Guild under the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was a tedious and huge project. Under normal circumstances, it would not be successful unless there was a huge change. Huge change? Brendel raised his head and looked at the ray of natural light that shone through the stone window in front of him. His dark brown eyes flickered with uncertainty. "How is it?" The red-haired middle-aged man touched the scar on his face and turned around to ask. Standing at a high place, the cool breeze caressed his face. He could not help but squint his eyes and stare at the town of Chablis. The town was like a man-made hill with a winding staircase going up the hill. The name, maned wolf, Makarov had been famous in the mercenary world for 6 or 7 years, and it was left behind when he first joined the mercenary world. It meant that he was brave and fierce, and he fought without any regard for his life. He was like a ferocious alpha wolf. Because in the southern mountains of Oween, the alpha wolf was also called a silver-maned wolf, hence the name. Buga put his hand on his forehead and smiled. "That kid's military swordsmanship is superb, almost at the level of a master. Even in the army?" He suddenly coughed. "You know what I'm talking about. If we're talking about swordsmanship, I'm not as good as him. That young man called Brando is a true genius, born for the sword. It's hard for me to believe that someone of his age could have such a deep understanding of swordsmanship. Do you know, I can't even move freely in front of him." He smiled. "Before I met young Master Eek, I never believed that there were geniuses in this world. A person can only reach that level through hard work and hard work. But after meeting young Master Eek, and especially after what happened today, I feel that I made a mistake. After saying that, he smiled, revealing his white teeth. You're comparing him to young Master Eek? Makarov turned around. The scar on his cheek was rumored to be from a battle with the Son of Night. But those who knew him well knew that he already had this scar before he became a mercenary. I don't think that young man has such skills. That's why you're the commander and I'm the swordsman. So, you have a very high opinion of him? Yes, but that young man reminded me of someone I know. Oh, a stubborn fellow. Let's not talk about that. I don't think that young man is a spy from paper cards. Byuga said, if they have such a talented backup, everyone would know about it. Makarov shook his head and smiled. It's hard to say. This is a sensitive time. I don't believe that paper cards is here just to snatch a mission from us. Chablis is just a small town without much profit. How can it be so attractive? You said that before, didn't you? You think they have other motives? Byuga asked. That's right. What are they after? Those lizard men bandits have other plans, or? I'm not sure, but Eek has been acting strangely for the past few days. Makarov closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I'm worried. I can't let a bunch of bastards follow us. The last mission was also because of them. This time, I want to get rid of them once and for all. Byuga looked at him. Grandmaster Eek agreed? Makarov nodded and shook his head. Grandmaster Eek didn't say anything. Then why don't we wait? We can't wait anymore. The tree herders are coming. Didn't you notice? Maned Wolf said against the wind, we'll leave in 3 days. What about that young man? Let him follow us. P.S. We're all civilized people, so please don't be rough with me. I'm already very pitiful equals. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.